One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Kesey. It's going to burn up finally telling about all this, about the hospital and her and the guys and about McMurphy. I've been silent so long, now it's going to roar out of me like floodwaters, and you think the guy telling this is ranting and raving. My God, you think this is too horrible to have really happened. This is too awful to be the truth, but please, it's still hard for me to have a clear mind thinking on it. But it's the truth, even if it didn't happen. They're out there. Black boys in white suits up before me to commit sex acts in the hall and get it mopped up before I can catch them. They're mopping when I come out of the dorm, all three of them, sulky and hating everything, the time of day, the place they're at here, the people they got to work around. Here's the chief, fellas, old Chief Broom. Here you go, Chief Broom. He sticks a mop in my hand and motions to the spot they aimed for me to clean today, and I go. One swats the back of my legs with a broom handle to hurry me past. Oh, you look at him, Shaggett's big enough to eat apples off my head, and he mind me like a baby. They laugh, and I hear them mumbling behind me, heads close together. Hum a black machinery, humming hate and death and other hospital secrets. They don't bother not talking out loud about their hate secrets when I'm nearby. They think I'm deaf and dumb. Everybody thinks so. I'm cagey enough to fool 'em that much. If my being half Indian ever helped me in any way in this dirty life, it helped me being cagey, helped me all these years. I'm mopping near the ward door when a key hits it from the other side, and I know it's the big nurse by the way the lockworks cleave to the key. Soft and swift and familiar, she'd been around locks so long. She slides through the door with a gust of cold and locks the door behind her. She's carrying her woven wicker bag, a bag shape of a toolbox with a hemp handle. She's had it all these years I've been here. It's a loose weave, and I can see inside it. There's no compact or lipstick or woman stuff. She's got that bag full of 1,000 parts she aims to use in her duties today. Wheels and gears, cogs polished to a hard glitter, tiny pills that gleam like porcelain, needles, forceps, watchmaker's pliers, rolls of copper wire. She dips a nod at me as she goes past. She walks stiff, down the hall to the glass nurse's station where she'll spend the day, sitting at her desk and looking out a window and making notes on what goes on out there in front of her in the day room during the next 8 hours. Her face looks pleased and peaceful with the thought. Then she sights those black boys mumbling to one another. They should have known better to group up and mumble together when she was due on the ward. Their faces bob apart, confused. She advances on where they're trapped in a huddle at the end of the corridor. She knows what they've been saying, and I can see she's furious, clean out of control. She's going to tear the black bastards limb from limb. She's so furious. But just as she starts crooking those arms around the black boys, all the patients start coming out of the dorms to check on what's the hullabaloo. And she has to change back before she's caught in the shape of her hideous, real self. By the time the patients get their eyes rubbed to where they can halfway see what the racket's all about, all they see is the head nurse smiling and calm and cold as usual, telling the black boys they'd best not stand in a group gossiping when it's Monday morning and there's such a lot of work to get done on the first morning of the week. Mean old Monday morning, you know, boys. Yeah, Miss Ratchet. And we have quite a number of appointments this morning, so perhaps if you're standing here in a group talking isn't too urgent. Yeah, Miss Ratchet. She stops and nods at some of the patients come to stand around and stare out of eyes all red and puffy with sleep. She nods once to each, precise, automatic gesture. Her face is smooth, calculated, and precision-made, like an expensive baby doll, skin like flesh-colored enamel, blend of white and cream and baby blue eyes, small nose, pink little nostrils, everything working together except the color on her lips and fingernails and the size of her bosom. I'm sitting in the day room. I hear noise at the ward door off up the hall out of my sight. That ward door starts opening at 8 and opens and closes 1,000 times a day. Kashash, click. Every morning we sit lined up each side of the day room, mixing jigsaw puzzles after breakfast, listen for a key to hit the lock, and wait to see what's coming in. There's not a whole lot else to do. Sometimes at the door it's a young resident in early so he can watch what we're like before medication. BM, they call it. Sometime it's a wife visiting there on high heels with her purse held tight over her belly. Sometimes it's a clutch of grade school teachers being led on a tour by the fool public relations man, saying how overjoyed he is that mental hospitals have eliminated all the old-fashioned cruelty. This morning the lockworks rattle strange. It's not a regular visitor at the door. An escort man's voice calls down edgy and impatient, "Admission, come sign for him," and the black boys go. Admission. Everybody stops playing cards and Monopoly, turns towards the day-room door. Even though I can't see him yet, I know he's no ordinary admission. I don't hear him slide scared along the wall with a weak little yes. He answers them right back in a loud, brassy voice. He sounds big. I hear him coming down the hall, and he sounds big. He's got iron on his heels, and he rings it on the floor like horseshoes. He shows up in the door and stops and hitches his thumbs in his pockets, boots wide apart, and stands there with the guys looking at him. "Good morning, buddies. Mighty nice fall day." This guy is red-headed with long red sideburns and a tangle of curls out from under his cap. Been needing a cut a long time, and he's broad across the jaw and shoulders and chest. A broad white devilish grin, and he's hard. A seam run across his nose and one cheekbone where somebody laid him a good one in a fight, and the stitches are still in the seam. He stands there waiting, and when nobody makes a move to say anything to him, he commences to laugh. I realize all of a sudden it's the first laugh I've heard in years. Everybody on the ward, patient, staff, and all, is stunned dumb by him and is laughing. There's no move to stop him, no move to say anything. He laughs till he's finished for a time, and he walks on into the day room. "My name is McMurphy, buddies, R.P. McMurphy, and I am a gambling fool. Yes, sir, that's what I came to this establishment for, to bring you birds fun and entertainment round the gaming table. Nobody left in that Pendleton work farm to make my days interesting anymore, so I requested a transfer, you see. Needed some new blood." He's got on work farm pants and shirt, sunned out till they're the color of watered milk. His face and neck and arms are the color of oxblood leather. He's got a primer black motorcycle cap stuck in his hair and a leather jacket over one arm, and he's got on boots gray and dusty and heavy enough to kick a man half in two. "What happened, you see, was I got in a couple of hassles at the work farm, to tell the pure truth, and the court ruled that I am a psychopath. Now, they tell me a psychopath's a guy fights too much and fucks too much. But they ain't wholly right, do you think? I mean, who ever heard tell of a man getting too much poozle? Hello, buddy, what'd they call you? My name is McMurphy." The new man stands looking a minute to get the setup of the day room. One side of the room, younger patients known as acutes, because the doctors figure them still enough to be fixed, practice arm wrestling and card tricks. Billy Bibbett tries to learn to roll a tailor-made cigarette, and Martini walks around discovering things under the tables and chairs. The acutes move around a lot. They tell jokes to each other and snigger in their fists. Nobody ever dares let loose and laugh. The whole staff would be in with notebooks and a lot of questions. And they write letters with yellow, runty-chewed pencils. Across the room from the acutes are the culls of the Combine's product, the chronics. Not in the hospital these to get fixed, but just to keep them from walking around the streets giving the product a bad name. Chronics are in for good, the staff concedes. Chronics are divided into walkers like me, can still get around if you keep 'em fed, and wheelers and vegetables. What the chronics are, or most of us, are machines with flaws inside that can't be repaired, flaws born in, or flaws beat in over so many years of the guy running head-on into solid things that by the time the hospital found him he was bleeding rust in some vacant lot. But there are some of us chronics the staff made a couple of mistakes on years back, some of us who were acutes when we came in and got changed over. Ellis is a chronic, came in an acute and got fouled up bad when they overloaded him in that filthy brain-murdering room that the black boys call the shock shop. Ruckley's another chronic came in a few years back as an acute. Ellis and Ruckley are the youngest chronics. Colonel Madison is the oldest, an old, petrified cavalry soldier from the First War who's given to lifting the skirts of passing nurses with his cane, or teaching some kind of history out of the text of his left hand to anybody that'll listen. He's the oldest on the ward, but not the one who's been here longest. His wife brought him in only a few years back when she got to where she wasn't up to tending him any longer. I'm the one been here on the ward the longest, since the Second World War. I've been here on the ward longer than anybody, longer than any of the other patients. The big nurse has been here longer than me. The chronics and the acutes don't generally mingle. Each stays on his own side of the day room the way the black boys want it. This new red-headed admission, McMurphy, knows right away he's not a chronic. After he checks the day room over a minute, he sees he's meant for the acute side and goes right for it. The acutes look spooked and uneasy when he laughs. I see McMurphy notices he's making them uneasy, but he don't let it slow him down. "Damn, what a sorry-looking outfit. You boys don't look so crazy to me." He's trying to get them to loosen up, the way you see an auctioneer spinning jokes to loosen up the crowd before the bidding starts. "Now, which one of you claims to be the craziest? Which one is the biggest loony? Who runs these card games? It's my first day, and what I like to do is make a good impression straight off on the right man if he can prove to me that he is the right man. Now, who is the bull goose loony here?" He's saying this directly to Billy Bibbett. He leans down and glares so hard at Billy that Billy feels compelled to stutter out that he isn't the bull goose loony yet, though he's next in line for the job. McMurphy sticks a big hand down in front of Billy, and Billy can't do a thing but shake it. "Well, buddy," he says to Billy, "you better take me to your leader and we'll get it straightened out. So who's going to be boss around here?" Nobody's sure if this barrel-chested man with the scar and the wild grin is play-acting, or if he's crazy enough to be just like he talks, or both. But they're all beginning to get a big kick out of going along with him. "Harding," Billy says, "I guess it'd be you. You're president of Patients' Council. This man wants to talk to you." Harding is a flat, nervous man with a face that sometimes makes you think you've seen him in the movies. Like it's a face too pretty to just be a guy on the street. When Billy points him out, Harding leans back in his chair and assumes an important look. "This man, Mr. Harding, is he the bull goose loony?" He looks at Billy with one eye, and Billy nods his head up and down real fast. Billy's tickled with all the attention he's getting. "Then you tell bull goose loony Harding that R.P. McMurphy is waiting to see him and that this hospital ain't big enough for the two of us. I'm accustomed to being top man. Then I'm bound to be a stomp-down, dead-gum good un. Tell this Harding that he either meets me man-to-man or he's a yeller skunk and better be out of town by sunset." Harding leans farther back, hooks his thumbs in his lapels. "Bibbett, you tell this young upstart McMurphy that I have been bull goose loony on this ward for nigh on to 2 years, and that I'm crazier than any man alive." "Mr. Bibbett, you might warn this Mr. Harding that I am so crazy I admit to voting for Eisenhower." "Bibbett, you tell Mr. McMurphy I'm so crazy I voted for Eisenhower twice." "And you tell Mr. Harding right back," he put both hands on the table and leans down, his voice getting low, "that I am so crazy I plan to vote for Eisenhower again this November." "I take my hat off," Harding says, bows his head and shakes hands with McMurphy. There's no doubt in my mind that McMurphy won, but I'm not sure just what. All the other acutes leave what they've been doing and ease up close to see what new sort of fellow this is. Nobody like him's ever been on the ward before. They're asking him where he's from and what his business is in a way I've never seen them do before. Then McMurphy comes down the line of chronics, shakes hands with Colonel Madison and with Ruckley and with old Pete. He shakes the hands of wheelers and walkers and vegetables, shakes hands that he has to pick up out of laps like picking up dead birds. I'm the last one, still in the chair in the corner. McMurphy stops when he gets to me and hooks his thumbs in his pockets again and leans back to laugh, like he sees something funnier about me than about anybody else. All of a sudden I was scared he was laughing because he knew the way I was sitting there with my knees pulled up and my arms wrapped around him, staring straight ahead as though I couldn't hear a thing, that it was all an act. "What's your story, Big Chief? You look like Sitting Bull on a sit-down strike." He looked over to the acutes to see if they might laugh about his joke. When they just sniggered, he looked back at me and winked again. "What's your name, Chief?" Billy Bibbett called across the room. "His name is Bromden, Chief Bromden. Everybody calls him Chief Broom, though, because the aides have him sweeping a large part of the time. There's not much else he can do. I guess he's deaf." McMurphy leaned his head down near mine, where I had to look at him. "Is that right? You deaf, Chief?" "He's deaf and dumb." McMurphy puckered his lips and looked at my face a long time. Then he straightened back up and stuck his hand out. "Well, what the hell? He can shake hands, can he? Deaf or whatever. By God, Chief, you may be big, but you shake my hand or I'll consider it an insult. And it's not a good idea to insult the new bull-goose loony of the hospital." "Mr. McMurphy, could you come here, please?" "It's the big nurse. The black boy has gone and got her." "Aide Williams tells me, Mr. McMurphy, that you've been somewhat difficult about your admission shower. Is that true? Please understand I appreciate the way you've taken it upon yourself to orient with the other patients on the ward, but everything in its own good time. Mr. McMurphy, I'm sorry to interrupt you and Mr. Bromden, but you do understand. Everyone must follow the rules." He tips his head back and gives that wink that she isn't fooling him any more than I did, that he's on to her. He looks up at her with one eye for a minute. "You know, ma'am," he says, "you know, that is the exact thing somebody always tells me about the rules." He grins. They both smile back and forth at each other, sizing each other up. "Just when I'm about to do the dead opposite." The big nurse tends to get real put out if something keeps her outfit from running like a smooth, accurate, precision-made machine. The slightest thing messy or out of kilter in a way ties her into a little white knot of tight-smiled fury. She walks around with the same doll smile crimped between her chin and her nose, and that same calm whir coming from her eyes, but down inside of her she's tense as steel. I know I can feel it. And she don't relax a hair till she gets the nuisance attended to, what she calls adjusted to surroundings. Year by year she accumulates her ideal staff. Doctors, all ages and types, come and rise up in front of her with ideas of their own about the way a ward should be run, some with backbone enough to stand behind their ideas, and she fixes these doctors with dry ice eyes day in, day out, until they retreat with unnatural chills. She keeps this up for years. The doctors last 3 weeks, 3 months, until she finally settles in for a little man with a big, wide forehead and wide, jowly cheeks. That's her doctor. Her 3 daytime black boys she acquires after more years of testing and rejecting thousands. The first one she gets 5 years after I've been on the ward, a twisted, sinewy dwarf the color of cold asphalt. The other 2 black boys come 2 years later, coming to work only about a month apart, and both looking so much alike I think she had a replica made of the one who came first. They're all tall and sharp and bony, and their faces are chipped into expressions that never change, like flint arrowheads. Their eyes come to points. If you brush against their hair, it rasps the hide right off you. All of them black as telephones. The blacker they are, she learned from that long, dark road that came before them, the more time they're likely to devote to cleaning and scrubbing and keeping the ward in order. For instance, all 3 of these boys' uniforms are always spotless as snow, white and cold and stiff as her own. Years of training, and all 3 black boys tune in closer and closer with the big nurse's frequency. She never gives orders out loud or leaves written instructions that might be found by a visiting wife or schoolteacher. Doesn't need to anymore. They're in contact on a high-voltage wavelength of hate. and the black boys are out there performing her bidding before she even thinks it. Each morning at 7 o'clock the mess hall opens. 7:30 back to the day room. The big nurse looks out through her special glass, always polished till you can't tell it's there, and nods at what she sees, reaches up and tears a sheet off her calendar one day closer to the goal. She pushes a button for things to start. Everybody come to order. Acutes, sit on your side of the day room and wait for cards and Monopoly games to be brought out. Chronics, sit on your side and wait for puzzles and the Red Cross box. 8 o'clock the walls whir and hum into full swing. The speaker in the ceiling says, "Medications," using the big nurse's voice. We look in the glass case where she sits, but she's nowhere near the microphone. In fact, she's 10 feet away from the microphone, tutoring one of the little nurses how to prepare a neat drug tray with pills arranged orderly. 9 o'clock, young residents wearing leather elbows talk to acutes for 50 minutes about what they did when they were little boys. The big nurse is suspicious of the crew-cut looks of these residents, and that 50 minutes they are there on the ward is a tough time for her. While they're around, the machinery goes to fumbling and she's scowling and making notes to check the records of these boys for old traffic violations and the like. 9:50 the residents leave and the machinery hums up smooth again. The nurse watches the day room from her glass case. The scene before her takes on that blue steel clarity again, that clean, orderly movement of a cartoon comedy. 10 o'clock the mail comes up. Sometimes you get a torn envelope. 10:30 public relations comes in with a ladies' club following him. He never looks at the men's faces. 10:45 patients shuttle in and out to appointments in ET or OT or PT, or in queer little rooms somewhere where the walls are never the same size and the floors aren't level. The machinery sounds about you reach a steady cruising speed. Yes, this is what I know. The ward is a factory for the combine. It's for fixing up mistakes made in the neighborhoods and in the schools and in the churches. The hospital is. When a completed product goes back into society, all fixed up good as new, better than new sometimes, it brings joy to the big nurse's heart. Something that came in all twisted different is now a functioning, adjusted component, a credit to the whole outfit, and a marvel to behold. Watch him sliding across the land with a welded grin, fitting into some nice little neighborhood, where they're just now digging trenches along the street to lay pipes for city water. He's happy with it. He is adjusted to surroundings finally. A successful dismissal like this as a product brings joy to the big nurse's heart and speaks good of her craft and the whole industry in general. Everybody's happy with a dismissal. But an admission is a different story. Even the best behaved admission is bound to need some work to swing into routine. And you can never tell when just that certain one might come in who's free enough to foul things up right and left, really make a hell of a mess, and constitute a threat to the wholesome smoothness of the outfit. And like I explain, the big nurse gets real put out if anything keeps her outfit from running smooth. Before noontime, they're at the fog machine again, but they haven't got it turned up full. It's not so thick but what I can see if I strain real hard. One of these days I'll quit straining and let myself go completely, lose myself in the fog the way some of the other chronics have. But for the time being I'm interested in the new man. I want to see how he takes to the group meeting coming up. 10 minutes to 1 the fog dissolves completely and the black boys are telling acutes to clear the floor for the meeting. All the tables are carried out of the day room to the tub room across the hall. Leaves the floor, McMurphy says, like we was aimin' to have us a little dance. The big nurse watches all this through her window. She hasn't moved from her spot in front of that one window for 3 solid hours, not even for lunch. The day room floor gets cleared of tables, and at 1 o'clock the doctor comes out of his office down the hall, nods once at the nurse as he goes past where she's watching out her window, and sits in his chair just to the left of the door. The patients sit down when he does. Then the little nurses and the residents straggle in. When everybody's down, the big nurse gets up from behind her window and goes back to the rear of the nurse's station to that steel panel with dials and buttons on it. Sets some kind of automatic pilot to run things while she's away, and comes out into the day room carrying the logbook and a basket full of notes. Her uniform, even after she's been here half a day, is still starched so stiff it don't exactly bend any place. It cracks sharp at the joints with a sound like a frozen canvas being folded. She sits just to the right of the door. She takes a folder from the basket. Now, at the close of Friday's meeting, we were discussing Mr. Harding's problem concerning his young wife. Does anyone care to touch upon this subject further? Harding shuts his eyes and nobody says anything. McMurphy looks around at the other guys, waiting to see if anybody's going to answer the nurse, then holds his hand up and snaps his finger like a school kid in class. The nurse nods at him. Mr. McMurphy? Touch upon what? What? Touch? You ask, I believe. Does anyone care to touch upon? Touch upon the subject, Mr. McMurphy, the subject of Mr. Harding's problem with his wife. Oh, I thought you mean touch upon her, something else. Now, what could you... But she stops. She was almost flustered for a second there. Then the nurse, calm as anything, takes out another folder and opens it and starts reading. McMurphy, Randall Patrick, committed by the state from the Pendleton farm for correction, for diagnosis and possible treatment, 35 years old, never married, Distinguished Service Cross in Korea for leading an escape from a communist prison camp, a dishonorable discharge afterwards for insubordination, followed by a history of street brawls and barroom fights and a series of arrests for drunkenness, assault, and battery, disturbing the peace, repeated gambling, and one arrest for rape. Rape, the doctor perks up. Statutory with a good... Whoa, now, couldn't make that stick, McMurphy says to the doctor. Girl wouldn't testify. The nurse closes up the folder and passes it across the doorway to the doctor. Our new admission, Dr. Spivey. Just like she's got a man folded up inside that yellow paper and can pass him on to be looked over. I thought I might brief you on his record later today, but as he seems to insist on asserting himself in the group meeting, we might as well dispense with him now. McMurphy doesn't say anything all the rest of the meeting, just sits and watches and doesn't miss a thing that's happened or a word that's said. That's a good rule for a smart gambler. Look the game over a while before you draw yourself a hand. The doctor talks about his theory of the therapeutic community until the big nurse asks him to hush so they can talk about Harding again. I've heard that theory enough times to repeat it forwards and backwards, how a guy has to learn to get along in a group before he'll be able to function in normal society, how the group can help the guy by showing him where he's out of place, how society's what decides who's sane and who isn't, so you got to measure up, all that stuff. Every time we get a new patient on the ward, the doctor goes into the theory with both feet. It's pretty near the only time he takes things over and runs the meeting. He's maybe got more to say, but about this point the big nurse usually hushes him up, and in the lull old Pete stands up and wigwags that battered copperpot head of his and tells everybody how tired he is, and the nurse tells somebody to go hush him up too so the meeting can continue, and Pete is generally hushed and the meeting goes on. The group is still tearing into poor Harding when 2 o'clock rolls around. At 2 o'clock, the doctor begins to squirm around in his chair. The meetings are uncomfortable for the doctor unless he's talking about his theory. He'd rather spend his time down in his office drawing on graphs. He squirms around, finally clears his throat, and the nurse looks at her watch and tells us to bring the tables back in from the tub room, and we'll resume this discussion again tomorrow. McMurphy's eyes follow all of this. He sits in his chair for a while, then finally stands up from his armchair, yawns and stretches, and walks over to where Harding is off by himself, seated by his chair. Well, say, buddy, is this the way these little meetings usually go? Usually go, Harding stares ahead past McMurphy. Is this a usual procedure for these group therapy shindigs? Harding is having a tough time holding his hand still, but he keeps trying to act calm. So, he says, it's as simple as that. As stupidly simple as that. You are on our ward 6 hours and have already simplified all the work of Freud, Jung, and Maxwell Jones. It's a shindig. I'm not talking about Fred Young or Maxwell Jones, buddy. I'm talking about that crummy meeting and what that nurse and those other bastards did to you. Did in spades. Did to me? That's right, every chance they got. McMurphy just keeps on looking at Harding. And you really think this crap that went on this meeting today is bringing about some kind of cure, doing some kind of good? What other reason would we have for submitting ourselves to it, my friend? The staff desires our cure as much as we do. They aren't monsters. Miss Ratched may be a strict, middle-aged lady, but she is not some kind of monster. Harding tries to grin, but his face and his lips are so white the grin is lost. He stares as McMurphy says, "No, that nurse ain't some kind of monster, buddy. What she is a ball cutter. I've seen thousands of 'em, old and young, men and women. Seen 'em all over the country and in the homes. People who try to make you weak so they can get you to toe the line, to follow their rules, to live like they want you to. And the best way to do this, to get you to knuckle under, is to weaken you by getting to you where it hurts the worst." Harding's face is still colorless. Our dear Miss Ratched, our sweet, smiling, tender angel of mercy, Mother Ratched, a ball cutter? Why, friend, that's most unlikely. Buddy, don't give me that damn little tender mother crap. She may be mother, but she's big as a damn barn and tough as a knife metal. She fooled me with that kind of little old mother bit for maybe 3 minutes when I came in this morning, but no longer. I don't think she's really fooled any of you guys for any 6 months or a year neither. Hoo-wee, I've seen some bitches in my time, but she takes the cake. When McMurphy stops talking, the ward is completely silent. I don't hear anything but a faint breathing rhythm while I figure there's a tape recorder somewhere getting all this down. You are right, Harding says, about all of it. He looks up at the other patients who are watching him. No one has ever dared come out and say it before, but there is not a man among us that doesn't think it, that doesn't feel just as you do about her and the whole business. Feel it somewhere down deep in his scared little soul. McMurphy frowns and asks, "What about that little fart of a doctor? He might be a little slow in the head, but not so much as not to be able to see how she's taking over and what she's doing." Harding takes a long pull off the cigarette and lets the smoke drift out with his talk. Dr. Spivey is exactly like the rest of us, completely conscious of his inadequacy. He's frightened, desperate, ineffectual, totally incapable of running this ward without our Miss Ratchet's help, and he knows it. And worse, she knows he needs our Miss Ratchet's help, and he knows it. And worse, she knows he knows it, and reminds him every chance she gets. Why don't he fire her? In this hospital, Harding says, the doctor doesn't hold the power of hiring and firing. That power goes to the supervisor, and the supervisor is a woman, a dear old friend of Miss Ratchet's. They were army nurses together in the 30s. We are victims of a matriarchy here, my friend, and the doctor is just as helpless against it as we are. You mean she'd accuse him of doing something wrong? No, she doesn't need to accuse. She has a genius for insinuation. Ball cutter? Oh, you underestimate her. McMurphy turns from Harding to the rest of the acute standing around. Here, all you guys, what the hell is the matter with you? You ain't as crazy as all this. Look at you running scared from some 50-year-old woman. What is there she can do to you anyway? Tell her to go to hell. The acutes are crowding closer around him. Harding answers him. Okay, you defy her, and you're listed as potential assaultive and shipped upstairs to the disturbed ward. And my friend, if you continue to demonstrate such hostile tendencies, such as telling people to go to hell, you get lined up to go to the shock shop, perhaps even on to greater things, an operation. The shock shop, Mr. McMurphy, is jargon for the EST machine, the electroshock therapy, a device that might be said to do the work of the sleeping pill, the electric chair, and the torture rack. It's a clever little procedure, simple, quick, nearly painless. It happens so fast, but no one ever wants another one. Ever. What's this thing do? You are strapped to a table, shaped, ironically, like a cross, with a crown of electric sparks in place of thorns. You are touched on each side of the head with wires. Zap! 5 cents worth of electricity through the brain, and you are jointly administered therapy and a punishment for the hostile go-to-hell behavior, on top of being put out of everyone's way for 6 hours to 3 days, depending on the individual. When you do regain consciousness, you are in a state of disorientation for days. You are unable to think coherently. You can't recall things. Enough of these treatments, and a man could turn into a mindless organism that eats and eliminates and yells or sits silently in a corner. That's it. Harding leans back and everybody waits for what McMurphy's going to say next. McMurphy can't see he's backed up against the wall. He looks at the faces a minute, then shrugs and stands up from his chair. I damn well don't want to have some old fiend of a nurse after me with 3,000 volts. Not when there's nothing in it for me but the adventure. No, you're right. McMurphy looks away from the bunch of faces hung around him, looks back at the nurse, and chews his lip. But you say she don't send you up to that other ward unless she gets your goat? Unless she makes you crack in some way and you end up cussing her out or busting a window or something like that? Unless you do something like that. You sure of that now? Because I'm getting just the shadiest notion I had to pick up a good purse off you birds in here, but I don't want to be a sucker about it. That hell of a time getting out of that other hole. I don't want to be jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. Absolutely certain. She's powerless unless you do something to honestly deserve the disturbed ward or EST. If you're tough enough to keep her from getting to you, she can't do a thing. So if I behave myself and don't cuss her out, or cuss one of the aides out, or cuss out one of the aides or tear up Jack somewhere or other around here, she can't do nothing to me. Those are the rules we play by. Of course, she always wins, my friend. Always. She's impregnable herself, and with the element of time working for her, she eventually gets inside everyone. That's why the hospital regards her as its top nurse and grants her so much authority. To hell with that. What I want to know is, am I safe to try to beat her at her own game? If I come on nice as pie to her, whatever else I insinuate, she ain't going to get in a tizzy and have me electrocuted. You're safe as long as you keep control, as long as you don't lose your temper and give her actual reason to request the restriction of the disturbed ward or the therapeutic benefits of electroshock. You are safe. But that entails first and foremost keeping one's temper. And you, with your red hair and black record, why delude yourself? Okay, all right. McMurphy rubs his palms together. Here's what I'm thinking. You birds seem to think you got quite the champ in there, don't you? What I want to know is how many of you are dead sure enough to put a little money on her? Dead sure enough? Just what I said. Any of you sharpies here willing to take my $5 that says I can get the best of that woman before the week's up without her getting the best of me? 1 week. And if I don't have her to where she don't know whether to shit or go blind, the bet is yours. He pulls off his cap, spins it on his finger, and catches it behind his back in his other hand, neat as you please. Harding takes out a pencil and writes something on the pinochle pad. Here, a lien on $10 of that money they've got drawing dust under my name over in funds. is worth twice that to me, my friend, to see this unlikely miracle brought off. McMurphy looks at the paper and folds it. Worth it to any of the rest of you birds? Other acutes line up now, taking turns at the pad. He takes the pieces of paper when they're finished, stacking them on his palm, pinned under a big stiff thumb. I see the pieces of paper crowd up in his hand. He looks them over. You trust me to hold the bets, buddies? I believe we can be safe in doing that, Harding says. You won't be going any place for a while. At 4:30, the swing shift comes on duty. The big nurse dismisses the black boys and takes a last look around the ward. Behind the glass, I see her tell everyone good evening. She hands the little swing shift nurse her instructions. Then her hand reaches out to the control panel in the steel door, clacks on the speaker in the day room, "Good evening, boys. Behave yourselves," and turns the music up louder than ever. Then till night we eat and shower and go back to sit in the day room. The acutes sit and play cards and work at getting a picture on our TV set by carrying the set every place the cord will reach in search of a good beam. The speakers in the ceiling are still making music. It comes off a long tape from the nurse's station, a tape we all know so well by heart that there don't any of us consciously hear it except new men like McMurphy. He hasn't got used to it yet. He's dealing blackjack for cigarettes and the speaker's right over the card table. Does that thing play night and day, Harding? I never heard such a driving racket in my life. Harding cocks his ear to the ceiling. Oh, yes, the so-called music. Yes, I suppose we do hear it if we concentrate. But then one can hear one's own heartbeat, too, if he concentrates hard enough. Do they leave it on all the time? McMurphy asks. Not when we sleep, Chiswick says. But all the rest of the time, and that's the truth. To hell with that. I'll tell that coon over there to turn it off or get his fat little ass kicked. He starts to stand up and Harding touches his arm. Friend, that is exactly the kind of statement that gets one branded assaultive. Are you so eager to forfeit the bet? McMurphy looks at him. That's the way it is, huh? A pressure game. Keep the old pinch on. That's the way it is. He slowly lowers himself back into the seat, saying, horse manure. I could have watched McMurphy at the blackjack table all night, the way he dealt and talked and roped him in and let him smack him up to the point where they were just about to quit and then back down a hand or two to give him confidence and bring him along. Then just before 9:30 and lights out, he started letting him win. He let him win it all back so fast they don't hardly remember losing. He pays out the last couple of cigarettes and lays down the deck and leans back with a sigh and shoves the cap out of his eyes, and the game is done. There isn't a man raking his pile of cigarettes that doesn't have a smirk on his face like he's the toughest gambler on the whole Mississippi. The next morning in the day room, McMurphy has the cards out again. Spends most of that morning dealing more blackjack, playing for IOUs now instead of cigarettes. He moves the blackjack table 2 or 3 times to try to get it out from under the music speaker. He can tell it's getting on his nerves. Finally, he goes to the nurse's station and raps on the pane of glass till the big nurse swivels in her chair and opens the door, and he asks her how about turning that infernal noise off for a while. She's back in her seat behind her pane of glass. Her smile is settled and solid. She closes her eyes and shakes her head and tells McMurphy very pleasantly, no. Can't you even ease down on the volume? It ain't like the whole state of Oregon need to hear Lawrence Welk play tea for 2-3 times every hour all day long. Soft enough to hear a man shout his bets across the table, I might get a game of poker going. You have been told, Mr. McMurphy, that it's against the policy to gamble for money on the ward. Okay, then, down soft enough to gamble for matches or for fly buttons. Just turn the damn thing down. Mr. McMurphy. She waits and lets her calm schoolteacher tone sink in before she goes on. She knows every acute on the ward is listening to them. Do you want to know what I think? I think that you are being very selfish. Haven't you noticed there are others in this hospital besides yourself? There are the old men here who couldn't hear the radio at all if it were lower. Old fellows who simply aren't capable of reading or working puzzles or playing cards to win other men's cigarettes. We like to hear suggestions and requests whenever we can. but I should think you might at least give some thought to others before you make your requests." He turns and looks over at the chronic side and sees there's something to what she says. He takes off his cap and runs his hand in his hair, finally turns back to her. He knows as well as she does that all the acutes are listening to everything they say. "Okay, I never thought about that." He tugs at that little tuft of red showing out of the neck of his greens, then says, "Well, hey, what do you say to us taking the card game someplace else? In some other room? Like, say, that room you people put the tables in during that meeting. There's nothing in there all the rest of the day. You could unlock that room and let the card players go in there, leave the old men out here with their radio a good deal all around." She smiles and closes her eyes again and shakes her head gently. "Of course, you may take the suggestion up with the rest of the staff at some time, but I'm afraid everyone's feelings will correspond with mine. We do not have adequate coverage for 2 day rooms. There isn't enough personnel." I see McMurphy start to say something and then stops, realizing she didn't leave him anything else to say unless he wants to start cussing at her. His face and neck are red. He draws a long breath and concentrates on his willpower and tells her that he's very sorry to have bothered her and goes back to the card table. Everybody on the ward can feel that it started. At 11 o'clock, the doctor comes to the day room door and calls over to McMurphy that he'd like to have him come down to his office for an interview. "I interview all new admissions on the second day." McMurphy lays down his cards and stands up and walks over to the doctor. The doctor asks him how his night was, but McMurphy just mumbles an answer. "You look deep in thought today, Mr. McMurphy." "Oh, I'm a thinker, all right," McMurphy says, and they walk off together down the hall. When they come back, what seems like days later, they're both grinning and talking and happy about something. The doctor's wiping tears off his glasses and looks like he's actually been laughing. McMurphy's back as loud and all of brass and swagger as ever. He's that way all through lunch, and at 1 o'clock he's the first one in his seat for the meeting, his eyes blue and ornery from his place in the corner. The big nurse comes into the day room with her covey of student nurses and her basket of notes, goes to her seat beside the door. She picks up some folders from the basket on her lap and riffles through them till she finds the one on Harding. As I recall, we were making quite a bit of headway yesterday with Mr. Harding's problem. Before we get into that," the doctor says, "I'd like to interrupt a moment, if I might. Concerning a talk Mr. McMurphy and I had in my office this morning, reminiscing, actually, talking over old times. You see, Mr. McMurphy and I find that we have something in common. We went to the same high school." The nurses look at one another and wonder what's gotten into this man. The patients glance at McMurphy grinning from his corner and wait for the doctor to go on. He nods his head. "Yes, the same high school, and in the course of our reminiscing, we happened to bring up the carnivals the school used to sponsor. Marvelous, noisy gala occasions, decorations, crepe streamers, booths, games. It was always one of the prime events of the year. I, as I mentioned to McMurphy, was the chairman of the high school carnival both my junior and senior years. Wonderful, carefree years." It's gotten real quiet in the day room. The doctor raises his head, peers around to see if he's making a fool of himself. The big nurse is giving him a look that shouldn't leave any doubts about it, but he doesn't have on his glasses, and the look misses him. Anyway, to put an end to this maudlin display of nostalgia, in the course of our conversation, McMurphy and I wondered what would be the attitude of some of the men towards a carnival here on the wards. He puts on his glasses and peers around again. Nobody's jumping up and down at the idea. "It'd be fun," Billy Bibbett says. "Oh, there are numerous possibilities," the doctor says, sitting up straight in his chair and really warming to it. Why, I've got a million ideas." He talks full steam ahead for another 5 minutes. You can tell a lot of the ideas are ideas he's already talked over with McMurphy. He describes games, booths, talks of selling tickets, then stops as suddenly as though the nurse had hit him right between the eyes. He blinks at her and asks, What do you think of the idea, Miss Ratchet, of a carnival here on the ward? I agree that it might have a number of therapeutic possibilities, she says, and waits. She lets that silence rear up from her again. When she's sure nobody's going to challenge it, she goes on. But I also believe that an idea like this should be discussed in staff meetings before a decision is reached. Wasn't that your idea, Doctor? Of course. I merely thought, and understand, I would feel out some of the men first, but certainly a staff meeting first. Then we'll continue our plans. Everybody knows that that's all there is to the carnival. The big nurse starts to bring things back into hand by rattling the folio she's holding. Fine. Then if there is no other new business, I think we might go right on into the discussion. We have... She takes her watch from the basket and looks at it. 48 minutes left. So as... Oh, hey, wait, I remembered there is some other new business. McMurphy has his hand up, fingers snapping. She looks at the hand for a long time before she says anything. Yes, Mr. McMurphy? Oh, not me. Dr. Spivey has. Doc, tell him what has come up about the hard-of-hearing guys on the radio. The nurse's head gives one little jerk, barely enough to see, but my heart is suddenly roaring. She puts the folio back in the basket, turns to the doctor. Yes, says the doctor. I very nearly forgot. He leans back and crosses his legs and puts his fingertips together. I can see he's still in good spirits about the carnival. You see, McMurphy and I were talking about that age-old problem we have in this ward, the mixed population, the young and the old together. He suggested the speaker might be turned up louder so the chronics with auditory weaknesses could hear it. It's a very, very humane suggestion, I think. McMurphy gives a modest wave of his hand, and the doctor nods at him and goes on. But I told him I had received previous complaints from some of the younger men that the radio is already so loud it hinders conversation and reading and so forth. So McMurphy said he hadn't thought of this, but mentioned that it did seem a shame that those who wished to read couldn't get off by themselves where it was quiet, and leave the radio for those who wished to listen. I agreed with him that it did seem a shame, and was ready to drop the matter. And then I happened to think of the old tub room where we store the tables during the ward meeting. We don't use the room at all, otherwise there's no longer a need for the hydrotherapy it was designed for now that we have new drugs. So how would the group like to have the room as a sort of second-day room? A game room, shall we say? The group isn't saying. They know whose play it is next. She folds Harding's folio back up and puts it on her lap and crosses her hands over it, looking around the room just like somebody might dare have something to say. When it's clear nobody's going to talk till she does, her head turns again to the doctor. It sounds like a fine plan, Dr. Spivey, and I appreciate Mr. McMurphy's interest in the other patients, but I'm terribly afraid we don't have the personnel to cover a second-day room. And is so certain that this should be the end of it, she starts to open the folio again. But the doctor has thought this through more than she figured. I thought of that too, Miss Ratchet, but since it will be largely the chronic patients who remain here in the day room with the speaker, most of whom are restricted to lounges or wheelchairs, one aide and one nurse in here should easily be able to put down any riots or uprisings that might occur, don't you think? She doesn't answer, and she doesn't care much for his joking about riots and uprisings either. But her face doesn't change. The smile stays. So the other two aides and nurses can cover the men in the tub room, perhaps even better than here in a large area. What do you think, man? Is it a workable idea? I'm rather enthused about it myself. The doctor looks around the room and sees all the other acutes nodding and smiling and looking so pleased with what he takes to be him and his idea. I thought for a minute there I saw the big nurse whipped, and maybe I did. But I see now that it don't make any difference. One by one the patients are sneaking looks at her to see how she's taking the way McMurphy is dominating the meeting, and they see the same thing. She's too big to be beaten. To beat her, you don't have to whip her 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 5, but every time you meet, as soon as you let your guard down, as soon as you lose once, she's won for good. And eventually we all get to lose. Nobody can help that. McMurphy keeps up his high-class manners around the nurses and the black boys in spite of anything they might say to him, in spite of every trick they pull to get him to lose his temper. A couple of times some stupid rule gets him mad, but he just makes himself act more polite and mannerly than ever till he begins to see how funny the whole thing is. The rules, the disapproving looks that they use to enforce the rules, the way of talking to you like you're nothing but a 3-year-old, and when he sees how funny it is, he goes to laughing, and this aggravates them no end. He's safe as long as he can laugh, he thinks, and it works pretty fair. Just once he loses control and shows he's mad, and then it's not because of the black boys or the big nurse and something they did, but it's because of the patients and something they didn't do. It happened at one of the group meetings. He got mad at the guys for acting too cagey, too chicken shit as he called it. He'd been taking bets from all of them on the World Series coming up Friday. He'd had it in mind that they would get to watch the games on TV, even though they didn't come on during regulation TV time. During the meeting a few days before, he asks if it wouldn't be okay if they did the cleaning work at night, during the TV time, and watched the games during the afternoon. The nurse tells him no, which is about what he expected. She tells him how the schedule has been set up for a delicately balanced reason that would be thrown into turmoil by the switch of routines. This doesn't surprise him coming from the nurse. What does surprise him is how the acutes act when he asks them what they think of the idea. Nobody says a thing. Now, look here, he tells them, but they don't look. He's been waiting for somebody to say something, answer his question. Nobody acts like they've heard it. Now, look here, damn it, he says when nobody moves. There's at least 12 guys I know of myself got a little personal interest who wins these games. Let's take a vote on watching TV during the afternoon instead of at night. All those in favor? Cheswick's hand comes up. Some of the other guys look around to see if there's any other fools. McMurphy can't believe it. Come on now, what is this crap? I thought you guys could vote on policy and that sort of thing. Isn't that the way it is, Doc? The doctor nods without looking up. Okay then, now who wants to watch those games? Cheswick shoves his hand higher and glares around. Scanlon shakes his head and then raises his hand, keeping the elbow on the arm of the chair. And nobody else. McMurphy can't say a word. If that's settled then, the nurse says, perhaps we should get on with the meeting. Yeah, he says, slides down in his chair till the brim of his cap nearly touches his chest. Yeah, perhaps we should get on with this son of a bitchin' meeting at that. After the meeting, McMurphy won't say a word to any of them. He's so mad and disgusted. He seems to give up, doesn't say anything about it again till the day before the series starts. Here it is, Thursday, he says, sadly shaking his head. He's sitting on one of the tables in the tub room with his feet on a chair, trying to spin his cap around one finger. Other acutes mope around the room and try not to pay any attention to him. Thursday, McMurphy says again. And tomorrow's Friday, McMurphy says. Harding turns a page of his magazine. And that will make nearly a week of our friend McMurphy has been with us without succeeding in throwing over the government. Is that what you're saying? The hell with that, McMurphy says. First series game is going to be played on TV tomorrow. What are we going to be doing? Mopping up this damn nursery again. Yeah, Cheswick says. Old Mother Ratchet's therapeutic nursery. Against the wall of the tub room, I get a feeling like a spy. The mop handle in my hand is made of metal instead of wood. Metal's a better conductor, and it's hollow. There's plenty of room inside it to hide a miniature microphone. If the big nurse is hearing this, she'll really get Cheswick. Let me see again, McMurphy says. How many of you birds will vote with me if I bring up that time switch again? About half the acutes nod yes, a lot more than would really vote. He puts his hat back on his head and leans his chin in his hands. I tell you, I can't figure it out. Harding, what's wrong with you, for crying out loud? You afraid if you raise your hand that old buzzard'll cut it off? Harding lifts one thin eyebrow. Perhaps I am. Perhaps I am afraid she'll cut it off if I raise it. What about you, Billy? Is that what you're scared of? No, I don't think she'd do anything, but he shrugs and sighs and climbs up on the big panel that controls the nozzles on the shower. Perches up there like a monkey. But I just don't think a vote would do any good, not in the long run. It's just no use, Mac. Do any good? Hoo-wee! Do you birds some good, just get the exercise lifting that arm. It's still a risk, my friend. She always has the capacity to make things worse for us. A baseball game isn't worth the risk, Harding says. Who the hell says so? Jesus, I haven't missed a World Series in years. Even when I was in the cooler one September, they let us bring in the TV and watch the series. They'd have had a riot on their hands if they hadn't. I just may have to kick that damn door down and walk to some bar downtown to see the game, just me and my buddy Cheswick. Fredrickson has come up behind McMurphy. You just going to raise one of those big He-Man boots of yours and kick down the door? A real tough guy, huh? McMurphy don't hardly look at Fredrickson. He learned that Fredrickson might act hard-boiled now and then, but it's an act that folds up under the slightest scare. What about it, He-Man? Fredrickson keeps on. Are you going to kick down the door and show us how tough you really are? No, Fred, I guess not. I wouldn't want to scuff up my boot. Yeah, okay, you've been talking so big, just how would you go about busting out of here? McMurphy takes a look around him. Well, I guess I could knock the mesh out of one of these windows with a chair when and if I took the notion. Don't try bothering Mac, Cheswick says. Fredrickson knows you'll just break a chair and end up undisturbed. The first day we arrived over here, we were given a demonstration about these screens. They're specially made. A technician picked up a chair just like that one you've got your feet on and beat the screen till the chair was no more than kindling wood. Didn't hardly dent the screen. Okay then, McMurphy says, taking a look around him. I can see he's getting more interested. I hope the big nurse isn't hearing this. He'll end up undisturbed in an hour. We need something heavier. How about one of the beds? A bed is too big even if you could lift it. It wouldn't go through the window. I could lift it all right. Well, hell, right over there you are. That thing Billy's sitting on. That big control panel with all the handles and the cranks. That's hard enough, ain't it? And it damn well should be heavy enough, and it don't look nailed down. No, it's not bolted. There's probably nothing holding it but a few wires, but look at it, for Christ's sakes. Everybody looks. The panel is steel and cement. Half the size of one of the tables. Probably weighs 400 pounds. Okay, I'm looking at it. Don't look any bigger than hay bales I've bucked into truck beds. I'm afraid, my friend, that this convenience will weigh a bit more than your bales of hay, says Harding. About a quarter-ton more, I'd bet, Fredrickson says. He's right, Mac, Cheswick says. Be awful heavy. Hell, you birds telling me I can't lift that dinky little gizmo? My friend, I don't recall anything about psychopaths being able to move mountains in addition to their other noteworthy assets. Okay, you say I can't lift it? Well, by God. McMurphy hops off the table and goes to peeling off his green jacket. The tattoos sticking half out of his t-shirt jump around the muscles on his arms. Then who's willing to lay $5? Nobody's going to convince me I can't do something till I try it. $5. McMurphy, this is as foolhardy as your bet about the nurse. Who's got $5 they want to lose? You hit or you sit. The guys all go to signing liens at once. He's beat them so many times at poker and blackjack they can't wait to get back at him, and this is a certain sure thing. Okay, stand out of the way. McMurphy shifts his feet a few times to get a good stance and wipes his hands on his thighs again, then leans down and gets hold of the levers on each side of the panel. When he goes to straining, the guys go to hooting and kicking him. He turns loose and straightens up and shifts his feet around again. Giving up, Fredrickson grins. Just limbering up. Here goes the real effort. And he grabs those levers again. And suddenly nobody's hooting at him anymore. His arms commence to swell, and the veins squeeze up to the surface. He clenches his eyes, and his lips draw away from his teeth. His head leans back, and tendons stand out like coiled ropes running from his heaving neck down both arms to his hands. His whole body shakes with the strain as he tries to lift something he knows he can't lift, something everybody knows he can't lift. But just for a second, when we hear the cement grind at our feet, we think, by golly, he might do it. And then his breath explodes out of him, and he falls back limp against the wall. There's blood on the levers where he tore his hands. He pants for a minute against the wall with his eyes shut. There's no sound but his scraping breath. Nobody saying a thing. He opens his eyes and looks around at us. One by one he looks at the guys, even at me, then he fishes in his pockets for all the IOUs he won the last few days at poker. He bends over the table and tries to sort them. But his hands are froze into red claws, and he can't work the fingers. Finally, he throws the whole bundle on the floor, probably $40 or $50 worth from each man, and turns to walk out of the tub room. He stops at the door and looks back at everybody standing around. "But I tried, though," he says. "God damn it. I sure as hell did that much now, didn't I?" And he walks out and leaves those stained pieces of paper on the floor for whoever wants to sort through them. It's Friday discussion meeting, and McMurphy is talking again. "Remember that vote we had a day or so back about the TV time? Well, today's Friday, and I thought I might just bring it up again, just to see if anybody else has picked up a little guts." "Mr. McMurphy, the purpose of this meeting is therapy, group therapy. And I'm not certain these petty grievances, someone says, 'Let 'em vote, why don't you?' Why you want to ship 'em to disturb just for bringing up a vote. Very well. But I think this is ample evidence of how much he is upsetting some of you patients. What is it you are proposing, Mr. McMurphy?" "I'm proposing a revote on watching the TV in the afternoon." "You're certain one more vote will satisfy you? We have more important things." "It'll satisfy me. I just kind of like to see which of these birds has any guts and which doesn't." It's that kind of talk, Dr. Spivey, that makes me wonder if the patients wouldn't be more content if Mr. McMurphy were moved. "Let him call the vote, why don't you?" "Certainly, Mr. Cheswick. A vote is now before the group. Will a show of hands be adequate, Mr. McMurphy, or are you going to insist on a secret ballot?" "I want to see the hands. I want to see the hands that don't go up, too." Everyone in favor of changing the television time to the afternoon, raise his hand. The first hand that comes up I can tell is McMurphy's because of the bandage where that control panel cut into him when he tried to lift it. And then off down the slope I see them, the other hands, coming up. It's like that big red hand of McMurphy's is reaching out and dragging the men up by their hands. First one, then another, then the next. Right on down the line of acutes, dragging them out of that fog till they stand, all 20 of them, raising not just for watching TV, but against the big nurse, against her trying to send McMurphy to Disturbed, against the way she's talked and acted and beat them down for years. Nobody says anything. I can feel how stunned everybody is, the patients as well as the staff. The nurse can't figure what happened. Yesterday, before he tried lifting that panel, there wasn't but 4 or 5 men might have voted. But when she talks, she don't let it show in her voice how surprised she is. "I count only 20, Mr. McMurphy." 20? Well, why not? 20 is all of us there is. His voice hangs as he realizes what she means. "Now, hold on just a goddamn minute, lady. I'm afraid the vote is defeated." "Hold on just one goddamn minute. There are 40 patients on the ward, Mr. McMurphy. 40 patients. And only 20 voted. You must have a majority to change the ward policy. I'm afraid the vote is closed. The hands coming down across the room. The guys know they're whipped, but McMurphy is on his feet. "Well, I'll be a son of a bitch. You mean to tell me that's how we're going to pull it? Count the votes of those old birds over there, too?" "A majority, Mr. McMurphy. It's in the ward constitution." "So this side you work this democratic bullshit? Hills, bills." "You seem upset, Mr. McMurphy. Doesn't he seem upset, Doctor? I want you to note this." "Don't give me that noise, lady. When a guy's getting screwed, he's got a right to holler. And we've been damn well screwed." "Perhaps, Doctor, in view of the patient's condition, we should bring this meeting to a close early today." "Now, wait a minute. Let me talk to some of these old guys." "The vote is closed, Mr. McMurphy." "Let me talk to him." "He's coming across the day room at us. He's bigger, and he's burning red in the face." "I said the voting is closed, Mr. McMurphy. You're just making a spectacle of yourself. He don't pay any attention to her. He comes on down the line of chronics." Come on, just one vote from you birds. Just raise a hand. Show her you can still do it." He's standing over me. "Chief, you're our last bet." The big nurse is folding her papers. The other nurses are standing up around her. She finally gets to her feet. "This meeting is adjourned, then, and I'd like to see the staff down in the staff room in about an hour. So if there is nothing, it's too late to stop it now." McMurphy did something to it that first day, put some kind of hex on it with his hand, so it won't act like I order it. There's no sense in it. Any fool can see. I wouldn't do it on my own. Just by the way the nurse is staring at me with her mouth empty of words, I can see I'm in for trouble, but I can't stop it. McMurphy's got hidden wires hooked to it, lifting it slow, just to get me out of the fog and into the open, where I'm fair game. He's doing it. Wires. No, that's not the truth. I lifted it myself. McMurphy whoops and drags me standing, pounding my back. 21! The chief's vote makes it 21, and by God, if that ain't a majority, I'll eat my hat. Yippee! Cheswick yells. The other acutes are coming across the room towards me. "The meeting was closed," she says. Her smile is still there, but the back of her neck as she walks out of the day room and into the nurse's station is red and swelling like she'll blow apart any second. McMurphy looks up at the clock and he says it's time for the game. He's over by the drinking fountain with some of the other acutes, down on his knees, scouring off the baseboard. I'm sweeping out the broom closet for the 10th time that day. He stands up, leaves the scouring rag where it lies. Nobody else stops work. McMurphy walks past the window where she's glaring out at him and grins at her like he knows he's got her whipped now. When he tips his head back and winks at her, she gives that little sideways jerk of her head. His armchair out, too, in front of the TV set, then switches on the set and sits down. He scratches his belly and yawns. Hoo-wee! Man, all I need me now is a can of beer. We can see the nurse's face get red and her mouth work as she stares at him. Then she gets up and goes to the steel door where the controls are, and she flips a switch and the TV picture swirls back into the gray. Nothing is left on the screen but a little eye of light beating right down on McMurphy sitting there. That eye don't faze him a bit. To tell the truth, he don't even let on he knows the picture's turned off. He puts a cigarette between his teeth and pushes his cap forward in his red hair till he has to lean back to see out from under the brim. The nurse stands this as long as she can. Then she comes to the door of the nurse's station and calls across to him. I said, Mr. McMurphy, that you are supposed to be working during these hours. Her voice has a tight whine like an electric saw ripping through pine. McMurphy, I'm warning you. Everybody stopped what he was doing. She looks around, then takes a step out of the nurse's station towards McMurphy. You are committed, you realize. You are under the jurisdiction of me, the staff. She's holding up a fist, all those red-orange fingernails burning into her palm. Under jurisdiction and control. Harding shuts off the buffer and leaves it in the hall, and pulls him a chair up alongside McMurphy, and sits down and lights him a cigarette too. "Mr. Harding, you return to your scheduled duties." I think how her voice sounds like it hit a nail, and this strikes me so funny I almost laugh. "Mr. Harding!" Then Cheswick goes and gets him a chair, and then Billy Bibbett goes, and then Scanlon, and then Fredrickson and Seffelt, and then we all put down our mops and brooms and scouring rags, and we all go pull us up chairs. "You men, stop this! Stop!" And we're all sitting there lined up in front of that blanked-out TV set, watching the gray screen, just like we could see the baseball game clear as day. And she's ranting and screaming behind us. If somebody had come in and took a look, men watching a blank TV, a 50-year-old woman hollering and squealing at the back of their heads about discipline and order and recriminations, they'd have thought the whole bunch of us was crazy as loons. All weekend and the next week, McMurphy was just as hard on the big nurse and her black boys as he ever was, and the patients were loving it. He'd won his bet. He'd got the nurse's goat the way he said he would, and had collected on it. But that didn't stop him from going right ahead and acting like he always had, hollering up and down the hall, laughing at the black boys, frustrating the whole staff, even going so far as to step up to the big nurse in the hall one time and ask her if she didn't mind telling just what was the actual inch-by-inch measurement on them great big old breasts that she did her best to conceal but never could. She walked right on past, ignoring him just like she chose to ignore the way nature had tagged her with those outsized badges of femininity, just like she was above him, and sex, and everything else that's weak and of the flesh. When she posted work assignments on the bulletin board, and he read that she'd given him latrine duty, he went to her office and knocked on that window of hers and personally thanked her for the honor, and told her he'd think of her every time he swabbed out a urinal. She told him that wasn't necessary. Just do his work, and that would be sufficient, thank you. And when the big nurse came in to check McMurphy's cleaning assignment personally, she brought a little compact mirror, and she held it under the rim of the bowls. She walked along shaking her head and saying, "Why, this is an outrage at every bowl." McMurphy sidled right along beside her, winking down his nose and saying in an answer, "No, that's a toilet bowl, a toilet bowl." Once he wrote something on a slip of paper, strange writing that looked like a foreign alphabet, and stuck it up under one of those toilet bowl rims with a wad of gum. When she came to that toilet with her mirror, she gave a short gasp at what she read reflected and dropped her mirror in the toilet. But she didn't lose control. That doll's face and that doll's smile were forged in confidence. She stood up from the toilet bowl and gave him a look that would peel paint and told him it was his job to make the latrine cleaner, not dirtier. In the group meetings there were gripes coming up that had been buried so long, the thing being griped about had already changed. Now that McMurphy was around to back them up, the guys started letting fly at everything that had ever happened on the ward they didn't like. McMurphy was getting a lot of kick out of all the ruckus he was raising, and I think he was a little surprised that he wasn't getting a lot of pressure from the staff, too, especially surprised that the big nurse wasn't having any more to say to him than she was. "I thought the old buzzard was tougher than this," he said to Harding after one meeting. "Maybe all she needed to straighten her out was a good bring-down. The thing is," he frowned, "she acts like she's still holding all the cards up that white sleeve of hers." He went on getting a kick out of it until about Wednesday of the next week. Then he learned why the big nurse was so sure of her hand. Wednesday's the day they pack everybody up who hasn't got some kind of rot and move to the swimming pool, whether we want to go or not. We came out of the locker room, and the pool was pitching and splashing and full of naked men. Whooping and yelling bounced off the high ceiling the way it always does in indoor swimming pools. The black boys herded us into it. The water was a nice warm temperature, but I didn't want to get away from the side. The black boys walked along the edge with long bamboo poles to shove you away from the side if you try to grab on. So I stayed close to McMurphy on account of I knew they wouldn't try to make him go into deep water if he didn't want to. He was talking to the lifeguard, and I was standing a few feet away. He and McMurphy had got to talking, saying how much difference between hospital and jail. And McMurphy was saying how much better the hospital was. The lifeguard wasn't so sure. I heard him tell McMurphy that, for one thing, being committed ain't like being sentenced. You're sentenced in a jail, and you got a date ahead of you when you know you're going to be turned loose. McMurphy stopped splashing around like he had been. He swam slowly to the edge of the pool and held there, looking up at the lifeguard. "And if you're committed?" he asked, after a pause. The lifeguard raised his shoulders in a muscle-bound shrug and tugged at the whistle around his neck. "I'm committed," he said. "I was picked up for drunk and disorderly, and I've been here 8 years and 8 months," he said. McMurphy pushed backwards from the edge of the pool and trod water and thought this over. He'd had a 6-month sentence at the work farm with 2 months finished, 4 more to go, and 4 more months was the most he wanted to spend locked up any place. He'd been close to a month in this nut house, and it might be a lot better than a work farm, what with good beds and orange juice for breakfast, but it wasn't better to the point that he'd want to spend a couple of years here. I could see it coming. The next day he surprised everybody on the ward by getting up early and polishing the latrine till it sparkled. And then he went to work on the hall floors when the black boys asked him to. Surprised everybody but the big nurse. She acted like it was nothing surprising at all. And that afternoon in the meeting, when Cheswick said that everybody agreed that there should be some kind of showdown in the cigarette situation, saying, "I ain't no little kid to have cigarettes kept from me like cookies. We want something done about it, ain't it right, Mac?" and waited for McMurphy to back him up. All he got was silence. He looked over at McMurphy's corner. Everybody did. McMurphy was there, studying the deck of cards that slid in and out of sight in his hands. He didn't look up. It was awfully quiet. There was just that slap of greasy cards and Cheswick's heavy breathing. "I want something done," Cheswick suddenly yelled again. "I ain't no little kid." He looked at McMurphy and got no look back, and went down the line of acutes looking for help. Each time a man looked away and refused to back him up, and the panic on his face doubled. His looking finally came to a stop at the big nurse. He stamped his foot again. "I want something done. Hear me? I want something done. Something. The 2 big black boys clamped his arms from behind, and the least one threw a strap around him. He sagged like he'd been punctured, and the 2 big ones dragged him up to Disturbed. You could hear the soggy bounce of him going up the steps. When they came back and sat down, the big nurse turned to the line of acutes across the room and looked at them. Nothing had been said since Cheswick left. "Is there any more discussion," she said, "on the rationing of cigarettes?" Looking down the cancelled row of faces hanging against the wall across the room from me, my eyes finally came to McMurphy in his chair in the corner. Concentrating on improving his one-handed card cut, and the white tubes in the ceiling begin to pump their refrigerated light again, I can feel it. Beams all the way into my stomach. After McMurphy doesn't stand up for us any longer, some of the acutes talk and say he's still outsmarting the big nurse, say that he got word she was about to send him to Disturbed and decided to toe the line a little while, not give her any reason. Others figure he's letting her relax, that he's going to spring something new on her, something wilder and more ornery than ever. You can hear them talking in groups, wondering. But me, I know why. I heard him talk to the lifeguard. He's finally getting cagey is all. It's safe, like hiding. It's a smart thing to do. Nobody could ever say any different. I know what he's doing. Then one morning all the acutes know too. Know his real reason for backing down, and that the reasons they've been making up were just lies to kid themselves. He never says a thing about the talk he'd had with the lifeguard, but they know. I figure the nurse broadcast this during the night along all the little lines in the dorm floor, because they know all at once. I can tell by the way they look at McMurphy that morning when he comes into the day room. Not looking like they're mad with him or even disappointed, because they can understand as well as I can that the only way he's going to get the big nurse to lift his commitment is by acting like she wants, but still looking at him like they wished things didn't have to be this way. Even Cheswick could understand it and didn't hold anything against McMurphy for not going ahead and making a big fuss over the cigarettes. He came back down from Disturbed on the same day that the nurse broadcast the information to the beds. And he told McMurphy himself that he could understand how he acted and that it was surely the sharpest thing to do, considering. And that if he'd thought about Mac being committed, he'd never have put him on the spot like he had the other day. He told McMurphy this while we were all being taken over to the swimming pool. But just as soon as we got to the pool, he said he did wish something might have been done, though, and dove into the water. And got his fingers stuck some way in the grate that's just over the drain at the bottom of the pool. And neither the big lifeguard nor McMurphy nor the two black boys could pry him loose. And by the time they got a screwdriver and undid the grate and brought Cheswick up, with the grate still clutched by his chubby pink and blue fingers, he was drowned. I remember it was Friday again, 3 weeks after we voted about the TV, and everybody who could walk was herded over to Building 1 for what they try to tell us is chest x-rays for TB, which I know is a check to see if everybody's machinery is still functioning to par. We're benched in a long row down a hall leading to a door marked X-ray. Next to X-ray is a door marked EENT, where they check our throats during the winter. Across the hall from us is another bench, and it leads to that metal door, with a line of rivets, and nothing marked on it at all. Two guys are dozing on the bench between two black boys, while another victim inside is getting his treatment, and I can hear him screaming. The door opens inward with a whoosh, and I can see the twinkling tubes in the room. They wheel the victim out, still smoking, and I grip the bench where I sit to keep from being sucked through that door. A black boy and a white one drag one of the other guys on the bench to his feet, and he sways and staggers under the drugs in him. They usually give you red capsules before shock. They push him through the door, and the technicians get him under each arm. For a second, I see the guy realizes where they got him, and he stiffens both heels into the cement floor to keep from being pulled to the table. Then the door pulls shut, thump, like metal hitting a mattress, and I can't see him any more. "Man, what they got going on in there?" McMurphy asks Harding. "In there? Why, that's right, isn't it? You haven't had the pleasure. Pity. An experience no human should be without." Harding laces his fingers behind his neck and leans back to look at the door. "That's the shock shop I was telling you about. The EST, the electroshock therapy. Those fortunate souls in there are being given a free trip to the moon. No, on second thought, it isn't completely free. You pay for the service with brain cells instead of money. And everyone has simply billions of brain cells on deposit. You won't miss a few." The door opens. A gurney comes whirring out, nobody pushing it, takes the corner on two wheels and disappears smoking up the hall. McMurphy watches them take the last guy in and close the door. What they do is, McMurphy listens for a moment. "Take some bird in there and shoot electricity through his skull?" "That's a concise way of putting it." "What the hell for?" "Why, the patient's good, of course. Everything done here is for the patient's good." Harding's hand touches McMurphy's knee. "Put your troubled mind at ease, my friend. In all likelihood you needn't concern yourself with EST. It's almost out of vogue, and only used in the extreme cases. Nothing else seems to reach, like lobotomy." "Now, lobotomy, that's chopping away part of the brain." "You're right again. You're becoming very sophisticated in the jargon. Yes, chopping away the brain. Frontal lobe castration. I guess if she can't cut below the belt, she'll cut above the eyes." "You mean ratchet?" "I do indeed." "I didn't think the nurse had the say-so on this kind of thing." "She does indeed." McMurphy acts like he's glad to get off talking about shock and lobotomy and get back to talking about the big nurse. "Scanlon, buddy, I plan to stay as clear of that old buzzard as I possibly can." "So I've been noticing," Harding says, smiling. "What's happened between the two of you? You had her on the ropes for a period there, then you let up. A sudden compassion for our angel of mercy?" "No, I found out a few things, that's why. I asked around some different places. I found out why you guys all kiss her ass so much and bow and scrape and let her walk all over you. I got wise to what you're using me for." "Oh, that's interesting." "You're blamed right it's interesting. It's interesting to me that you bums didn't tell me what a risk I was running, twisting her tail that way. Why should it be me goes to bat at these meetings over these piddling little graps about keeping the dorm door open and about cigarettes in the nurse's station? I couldn't figure it at first why you guys are coming to me like I'm some kind of savior. Then I just happened to find out about the way the nurses have the big say as to who gets discharged and who doesn't, and I got wise awful damn fast. I said, why, those slippery bastards have conned me, snowed me into holding their bag. That don't beat all. Conned old R.P. McMurphy." He tips his head back and grins at the line of us on the bench. "Well, I don't mean nothing personal, you understand, buddies, but screw that. I want out of here just as much as the rest of you. I got just as much to lose hassling that old buzzard as you do." He grins and winks down his nose and digs Harding in the ribs with his thumb, like he's finished with the whole thing but no hard feelings, when Harding says something else. "No, you've got more to lose than I do, my friend. I'm voluntary. I'm not committed. There are only a few men on the ward who are committed. Only Scanlon and, well, I guess some of the chronics. And you. Not many commitments in the whole hospital. No, not many at all." Then he stops, his voice dribbling away under McMurphy's eyes. After a bit of silence, McMurphy says softly, "Are you bullshitting me?" Harding shakes his head. He looks frightened. McMurphy stands up in the hall and says, "Are you guys bullshitting me?" Nobody'll say anything. McMurphy turns round to the rest of the guys and opens his mouth to ask something else, and then closes it when he sees how they're looking at him. He stands there a minute with a row of eyes aimed at him like a row of rivets. Then he says, "Hell's bells," in a weak sort of way, and he pulls his cap down hard and goes back to his place on the bench. McMurphy kept quiet during the meeting that afternoon. I'd been half listening to them work on Sefelt to get him to face up to the reality of his problem so he could adjust when I happened to catch a look at McMurphy sitting in his corner. He wasn't fiddling with a deck of cards or dozing into a magazine like he had been during all the meetings the last 2 weeks, and he wasn't slouched down. He was sitting up stiff in his chair with a flushed, reckless look on his face as he looked back and forth from Sefelt to the big nurse. I was certain that any minute he was going to do some crazy thing to get him up undisturbed for sure. I'd seen the same look on other guys before they'd climbed all over a black boy. I gripped down on the arm of my chair and waited, scared it would happen, and I began to realize just a little scared it wouldn't. He kept quiet and watched till they were finished with Sefelt. Then he swung half around in his chair and watched while Fredrickson, trying some way to get back at them for the way they had grilled his friend, griped for a few loud minutes about the cigarettes being kept in the nurse's station. Fredrickson talked himself out and finally flushed and apologized like always and sat back down. McMurphy still hadn't made any kind of move. I eased up where I'd been gripping the arm of the chair, beginning to think I'd been wrong. There was a couple of minutes left in the meeting. The big nurse folded up her papers and put them in the basket and set the basket off her lap on the floor, then let her eyes swing to McMurphy for just a second like she wanted to check if he was awake and listening. She folded her hands in her lap and looked down at the fingers and drew a deep breath, shaking her head. "Boys, I've given a great deal of thought to what I am about to say. I've talked it over with the doctor and with the rest of the staff. And as much as we regretted it, we all came to the same conclusion, that there should be some manner of punishment meted out for the unspeakable behavior concerning the house duties 3 weeks ago." Her hand went up to stop any interruptions that might come. "We must take away a privilege. And after careful consideration of the circumstances, of this rebellion, we've decided that there would be a certain justice in taking away the privilege of the tub room that you men have been using for your card games during the day. Does this seem unfair?" Her head didn't move. She didn't look. But one by one everybody else looked at him sitting there in his corner. Even the old chronics, wondering why everybody had turned to look in one direction, stretched out their scrawny necks like birds and turned to look at McMurphy. Faces turned to him full of a naked, scared hope. That single note in my head was like tires speeding down a pavement. He was sitting straight up in his chair, one big red finger scratching lazily at the stitch marks run across his nose. He grinned at everybody looking at him, and took his cap by the brim and tipped it politely, then looked back at the nurse. "So, if there is no discussion on this ruling, I think the hour is almost over." She paused again, took a look at him herself. He shrugged his shoulders and with a loud sigh slapped both hands down on his knees and pushed himself standing out of the chair. He stretched and yawned and scratched the nose again and started strolling across the day-room floor to where she sat by the nurse's station, heisting his pants with his thumbs as he walked. I could see it was too late to keep him from doing whatever fool thing he had in mind, and I just watched like everybody else. He walked with long steps, too long, and he had his thumbs hooked in his pockets again. The iron in his boot heels cracked lightning out of the tile. He was the logger again, the swaggering gambler, the big red-headed brawling Irishman, the cowboy out of the TV set walking down the middle of the street to meet a dare. The big nurse's eyes swelled out white as he got close. She hadn't reckoned on him doing anything. This was supposed to be her final victory over him, supposed to establish her rule once and for all. But here he comes, and he's big as a house. She started popping her mouth and looking for her black boy, scared to death, but he stopped before he got to her. He stopped in front of her window and said in his slowest, deepest drawl how he figured he could use one of the smokes he bought this morning, then ran his hand right through the glass. The glass came apart like water splashing, and the nurse threw her hands to her ears. He got one of the cartons of cigarettes with his name on it and took out a pack, then put it back and turned to where the big nurse was sitting like a chalk statue and very tenderly went to brushing the slivers of glass off her hat and shoulders. "I'm sure sorry, ma'am," he said. "God, but I am. That window glass was so spick and span, I completely forgot it was there." It took just a couple of seconds. He turned and left her sitting there with her face shifting and jerking, and walked back across the day-room to his chair, lighting up a cigarette. After that, McMurphy had things his way for a good long while. The nurse was biding her time till another idea came to her that would put her on top again. She knew she'd lost one big round and was losing another, but she wasn't in any hurry. For one thing, she wasn't about to recommend release. The fight could go on as long as she wanted, till he made a mistake or till he just gave out, or until she could come up with some new tactic that would put her back on top in everybody's eyes. A good lot happened before she came up with that new tactic. After McMurphy was drawn out of what you might call a short retirement and had announced he was back in the hassle by breaking out her personal window, he made things on the ward pretty interesting. He took part in every meeting, every discussion, winking, joking his best to wheedle a skinny laugh out of some acute who'd been too scared to grin since he was 12. He got together enough guys for a basketball team and some way talked the doctor into letting him bring a ball back from the gym to get the team used to handling it. The nurse objected, said the next thing they'd be playing soccer in the day room and polo games up and down the hall, but the doctor held firm for once and said let him go. "A number of the players, Miss Ratchet, have shown marked progress since that basketball team was organized. I think it has proven its therapeutic value." She looked at him a while in amazement. So he was doing a little muscle flexing too. She marked the tone of his voice for later, for when her time came again, and just nodded and went to sit in her nurse's station and fiddle with the controls on her equipment. The janitors had put a cardboard in the frame over her desk till they could get another window pane cut to fit, and she sat there behind it every day like it wasn't even there, just like she could still see right into the day room. Behind that square of cardboard she was like a picture turned to the wall. She waited without comment while McMurphy continued to run around the halls in the mornings in his shorts, or pitched pennies in the dorms, or ran up and down the hall blowing a nickel-plated ref's whistle, teaching acutes the first break from ward door to the seclusion room at the other end, the ball pounding in the corridor like cannon shots, and McMurphy roaring like a sergeant, "Drive, you puny mothers, drive!" When either one spoke to the other, it was always in the most polite fashion. He would ask her nice as you please if he could use her fountain pen to write a request for an unaccompanied leave from the hospital, wrote it out in front of her on her desk, and handed her the request and the pen back at the same time with such a nice "thank you," and she would look at it and say just as polite that she would take it up with the staff, which took maybe 3 minutes, and come back to tell him she certainly was sorry, but a pass was not considered therapeutic at this time. He would thank her again and walk out of the nurse's station and blow that whistle loud enough to break windows for miles and holler, "Practice, you mothers! Get that ball and let's get a little sweat rolling." He'd been on the ward a month, long enough to sign the bulletin board in the hall to request a hearing and group meeting about an accompanied pass. He went to the bulletin board with her pen and put down under "to be accompanied by" "a twitch I know from Portland named Candy Star," and ruined the pen point on the period. The pass request was brought up in group meeting a few days later, the same day, in fact, that Workman put a new glass window in front of the big nurse's desk, and after his request had been turned down on the grounds that this Miss Starr didn't seem like the most wholesome person for a patient to go pass with, he shrugged and said, "That's how she bounces, I guess," and got up and walked to the nurse's station, to the window that still had the sticker from the glass company down in the corner, and ran his fist through it again. Explained to the nurse while blood poured from his fingers that he thought the cardboard had been left out and the frame was open. "When did they sneak that dang glass in there? Why, that thing is a menace." The nurse taped his hand in the station while Scanlon and Harding dug the cardboard out of the garbage and taped it back in the frame, using adhesive from the same roll the nurse was bandaging McMurphy's wrist and fingers with. McMurphy sat on a stool, grimacing something awful while he got his cuts tended, winking at Scanlon and Harding over the nurse's head. The expression on her face was calm and blank as enamel, but the strain was beginning to show in other ways, by the way she jerked the adhesive tight as she could, showing her remote patience wasn't what it used to be. We got to go to the gym and watch our basketball team, Harding, Billy Bibbett, Scanlon, Fredrickson, Martini, and McMurphy, whenever his hand would stop bleeding long enough for him to get in the game, play a team of aides. Our 2 big black boys played for the aides. They were the best players on the court, running up and down the floor together like a pair of shadows in red trunks, scoring basket after basket with mechanical accuracy. Our team was too short and too slow, and Martini kept throwing passes to men that nobody but him could see, and the aides beat us by 20 points. But something happened that let most of us come away feeling there'd been a kind of victory anyhow. In one scramble for the ball, our big black boy named Washington got cracked with somebody's elbow, and his team had to hold him back as he stood straining to where McMurphy was sitting on the ball, not paying the least bit of heed to the thrashing black boy with red pouring out of his nose and down his chest, like paint splashed on a blackboard, and hollering to the guys holding him, "He's begging for it! The son of a bitch is just begging for it!" McMurphy composed more notes for the nurse to find in the latrine with her mirror. He wrote long, outlandish tales about himself in the logbook and signed them Anon. Sometimes he slept till 8 o'clock, She would reprimand him without heat at all, and he would stand and listen till she was finished, and then destroy her whole effect by asking something like, did she wear a B cup, he wondered, or a C cup, or any old cup at all. The other acutes were beginning to follow his lead. Harding began flirting with all the student nurses, and Billy Bibbett completely quit writing what he used to call his observations in the logbook. And when the window in front of her desk got replaced again, with a big X across it in whitewash to make sure McMurphy didn't have any excuse for not knowing it was there, Scanlon did it in by accidentally bouncing our basketball through it before the whitewashed X was even dry. The ball punctured, and Martini picked it off the floor like a dead bird and carried it to the nurse in the station, where she was staring at the new splash of broken glass all over her desk. He asked her, couldn't she please fix it with tape or something? Make it well again? Without a word, she jerked it out of his hand and stuffed it in the garbage. One night, McMurphy jumped off his bed and went to rustling through his nightstand. I heard him shut the bedstand, and it echoed like a boiler door. I heard him say, "Here," and something lit on my bed. Little. Just the size of a lizard or a snake. "Juicy fruit is the best I can do for you at the moment, Chief. Package I went off Scanlon pitching pennies," and he got back in bed. And before I realized what I was doing, I told him, "Thank you." He didn't say anything right off. He was up on his elbow watching me, waiting for me to say something else. I picked up the package of gum from the bedspread and held it in my hand and told him, "Thank you." It didn't sound like much because my throat was rusty and my tongue creaked. He told me I sounded a little out of practice and laughed at that. I tried to laugh with him, but it was a squawking sound, like a pullet trying to crow. It sounded more like crying than laughing. "What I was wondering, Chief, are you biding your time towards the day you decide to lay into 'em?" "No," I told him. "I couldn't tell 'em off. It's easier than you think." "You're a lot bigger, tougher'n I am," I mumbled. "How's that? I didn't get you, Chief." I worked some spit down my throat. "You're bigger and tougher than I am. You can do it." "Me? Are you kidding? Criminy, look at you. You stand a head taller than any man on the ward. There ain't a man here you couldn't turn every way but loose, and that is a fact." "No, I'm way too little. I used to be big, but not no more. You're twice the size of me." "Whoo, boy, are you crazy? You're crazy, aren't you?" I said, "You shouldn't have broke that window. They see you're big now. Now they got to bust you." "Like busting a Mustang, huh?" No, listen. They don't bust you that way. They work on you ways that you can't fight. They put things in. They install things. They start as quick as they see you're gonna be big and go to working and installing their filthy machinery when you're little, and keep on and on and on till you're fixed. Now take her easy, buddy. Shh. And if you fight, they lock you someplace and make you stop. Easy, Chief, easy. Just scold it for a while. They heard you." He lay down and kept still. My bed was hot, I noticed. I could hear the squeak of rubber soles as the black boy came in with a flashlight to see what the noise was. We lay still till he left. "I been talking crazy, ain't I?" "Yeah, Chief," he rolled over in his bed. "You been talking crazy." "It wasn't what I wanted to say. I can't say it all. It don't make sense." I didn't say it didn't make sense, Chief. I said it was talking crazy. He didn't say anything else to me for a long while. Then he said, Chief, slowly looking me over, when you were big and strong, when you used to be, were you strong enough to lift something the size of that control panel in the tub room? I thought about that panel. It probably didn't weigh a lot more than oil drums I'd lifted in the Army. I told him I probably could have at one time. If you got that big again, could you still lift it? I told him I thought so. To hell with what you think. I want to know, can you promise to lift it if I get you big as you used to be? You promise me that, and you get my special bodybuilding course for nothing. He lay there chuckling over some thought of his own. When I asked him how he was going to get me big again, he shushed me with a finger to his lips. Man, we can't let a secret like this out. But if I give you my solemn word, you follow my training program, and you'll get there. Next morning, McMurphy came back from making a phone call to announce that he had fixed it for a couple of girls to visit him in the hospital. He told Billy that he could have a date with Candy for certain, and added, writing an address down for him, that it might be a good idea to send her a little bread for the trip. Bread? Money? How much? He looked over to where Harding was grinning at him. Oh, you know, man, maybe $10 for her and $20. It doesn't cost that much for bus fare down there. McMurphy looked up from under his hat brim, gave Billy a slow grin, then rubbed his throat with his hand, running out a dusty tongue. Boy, oh boy, but I'm terrible dry. Figured to be even drier by a week come Saturday. You wouldn't begrudge her bringing me a little swallow, would you, Billy boy? And gave Billy such an innocent look Billy had to laugh and shake his head. No. And go off to a corner to excitedly talk over the next Saturday's plans with the man he probably considered a pimp. Big Nurse knew she had only to wait her time, and McMurphy would give her her chance. And he did. He landed his fist on one of her black boys and split his nose open. The Big Nurse moved fast. They gave McMurphy 3 shock treatments that week. As quick as he started coming out of one, getting the click back in his wink, Miss Ratched would arrive with a doctor, and they would ask him if he felt like he was ready to come around and face up to his problem and come back to the ward for a cure. And he'd play up, aware that every one of those faces undisturbed had turned towards him and was waiting. And he'd tell the nurse he regretted that he had but one life to give for his country, and she could kiss his rosy red ass before he'd give up the goddamn ship. Yeah. Then stand up and take a couple of bows to those guys grinning at him, while the nurse led the doctor into the station to phone over to the main building and authorize another treatment. Once, as she turned to walk away, he got hold of her through the back of her uniform, gave her a pinch that turned her face as red as his hair. I think if the doctor hadn't been there, hiding a grin himself, she would have slapped McMurphy's face. I tried to talk him into playing along with her so as to get out of the treatment, but he just laughed and told me, hell, all they're doing is charging my battery for me, free for nothing. When I get out of here, the first woman that takes on old Red McMurphy, the 10,000-watt psychopath, she's going to light up like a pinball machine and pay off in silver dollars. No, I ain't scared of their little battery charger. He insisted it wasn't hurting him. He wouldn't even take his capsules. But every time that loudspeaker called for him to forego breakfast and prepare to walk to Building 1, the muscles in his jaw went taut, and his whole face drained of color, looking thin and scared. When the nurse herself brought the problem of patient McMurphy up in group the next day, said that for some unusual reason he did not seem to be responding to EST at all, and that more drastic means might be required to make contact with him, Harding said, "Now that is possible, Miss Ratched, yes. But from what I hear about your dealings upstairs with McMurphy, he hasn't had any difficulty making contact with you." She was thrown off balance and flustered so bad with everybody in the room laughing at her that she didn't bring it up again. She saw that McMurphy was growing bigger than ever while he was upstairs, where the guys couldn't see the dent she was making on him, growing almost to a legend. A man out of sight can't be made to look weak, she decided, and started making plans to bring him back to our ward. She figured the guys could see for themselves then he could be as vulnerable as the next man. He couldn't continue in his hero role if he was sitting around the day room all the time in a shock stupor. The guys anticipated this, and that as long as he was on the ward for them to see, she would be giving him shock every time he came out of it. So Harding and Scanlon and Fredrickson and I talked over how we would convince him that the best thing for everybody concerned would be his escaping the ward. And by the Saturday when he was brought back to the ward, footworking into the day room like a boxer into a ring, clasping his hands over his head and announcing the champ was back, we had our plan all worked out. We'd wait until dark, set a mattress on fire, and when the firemen came, we'd rush him out of the door. It seemed such a fine plan we couldn't see how he could refuse. But we didn't think about it as being the day he'd made a date to have the girls sneak into the ward. They brought him back to the ward about 10 in the morning. "Full of piss and vinegar, buddies. They checked my plugs and cleaned my points, and I got a glow on like a Model T spark coil." We told him of our plan for escape, and he told us there was no hurry and reminded us of Billy's date. "We can't disappoint Billy boy, can we, buddies? Not when he's about to cash in his cherry. And it should be a nice little party tonight if we can pull it off. Let's say maybe it's my going-away party." At midnight, when Geever and the other black boy and the nurse went off duty, and the old colored fellow, Mr. Turkle, came on for his shift, McMurphy and Billy were already up. I got out of bed and put on a robe and walked out to the day room where they were talking to Mr. Turkle. Harding and Scanlon and Sefelt and some of the other guys came out too. McMurphy was telling Mr. Turkle what to expect if the girls did come. Reminding him, actually, because it looked like they'd talked it all over beforehand a couple of weeks back. McMurphy said that the thing to do was let the girls in the window, instead of risking having them come through the lobby where the night supervisor might be, and to unlock the seclusion room then. "Yeah, won't that make a fine honeymoon shack for the lovers? Mighty secluded." McMurphy, Billy kept trying to say, and to keep the lights out so the supervisor couldn't see in, and close the dorm doors and not wake up every slobbering chronic in the place, and to keep quiet. We don't want to disturb them. "Oh, come on, Mac," Billy said. Mr. Turkle kept nodding and bobbing his head, and McMurphy said, "I guess that pretty well covers things." Billy got more and more nervous, afraid the girl might not show up, afraid she might. He kept asking why we didn't all go to bed, instead of sitting out there in the cold dark like hounds waiting at the kitchen for table scraps, and we just grinned at him. None of us felt like going to bed. It wasn't cold at all, and it was pleasant to relax in the half-light and listen to McMurphy and Mr. Turkle tell tales. Nobody acted sleepy, or not even very worried that it was after 2 o'clock and the girls hadn't showed up yet. Turkle suggested maybe they were late because the ward was so dark they couldn't see to tell which one to come to. And McMurphy said that was the obvious truth, so the two of them ran up and down the halls, turning on every light in the place. No sooner did they have the ward lit up like full daylight than there came a tapping at the window. McMurphy ran to the window and put his face to it, cupping his hands on each side so he could see. He drew back and grinned at us. "She walks like beauty in the night," he said. He took Billy by the wrist and dragged him to the window. "Let 'em in, Turkle. Let this mad stud at 'em." "Look, McMurphy, wait," Billy was balking like a mule. "Don't you Murphy me, Billy boy. It's too late to back out now." "You'll pull through. I tell you what, I got $5 here, says you burn that woman down. All right, open the window, Turkle. There were the two girls in the dark. They were both in skirts and sweaters and nylons and barefoot, and both red-cheeked and giggling. Sandy and I had to keep asking for directions, Candy explained, at every bar we came to. Sandy was turning around in a big wide-eyed circle. Hoo-wee, Candy girl. What are we in now? Is this real? Are we in an asylum? Man. We were all in an awkward little cluster in the middle of the day room, shifting around one another, saying things just because nobody knew what else to do yet. Never been up against a situation like it. And I don't know when this excited, uneasy flurry of talk and giggling and shuffling around the day room would have stopped if that ward door hadn't rung with a key knocking it open down the hall. Jarred everybody like a burglar alarm going off. Oh, good Lord, Mr. Turkle said, clapping his hand on the back of his bald head. It's the supervisor come to fire my black ass. We all ran into the latrine and turned out the light and stood in the dark, listening to one another breathe. We could hear that supervisor wander around the ward, calling for Mr. Turkle in a loud, half-afraid whisper. Her voice was soft and worried, rising at the end as she called, Mr. Turkle! Mr. Turkle! Where the hell is he? McMurphy whispered. Why don't he answer her? Don't worry, Scanlon said. She won't look in the can. But why don't he answer? Maybe he got too high. Man, what are you talking? I don't get too high. Not on a little middling joint like that one. It was Mr. Turkle's voice somewhere in the dark latrine with us. Jesus, Turkle, what are you doing in here? McMurphy was trying to sound stern and keep from laughing at the same time. Get out of here and see what she wants. What'll she think if she doesn't find you? The end is upon us, Harding said and sat down. Allah be merciful. Turkle opened the door and slipped out and met her in the hall. She'd come over to see what all the lights were on about, what made it necessary to turn on every fixture in the ward. Turkle said every fixture wasn't on, that the dorm lights were off and so were the ones in the latrine. She said that was no excuse for the other lights. What possible reason could there be for all this light? Turkle couldn't come up with an answer for this, and during the long pause I heard the bottle being passed around near me in the dark. Out in the hall she asked him again, and Turkle told her, well, he was just cleaning up the place, policing the areas. She wanted to know why, then, was the latrine, the place that his job description called for him to have clean, the only place that was dark. And the bottle went around again while we waited to see what he'd answer. It came by me, and I took a drink. I felt I needed it. I could hear Turkle swallowing all the way out in the hall, umming and aching for something to say. He's scalded, McMurphy hissed. Somebody's going to have to go out and help him. I heard a toilet flush behind me, and the door opened and Harding was caught in the hall light as he went out, pulling up his pajamas. I heard the supervisor gasp at the sight of him, and he told her to pardon him, but he hadn't seen her, being as it was so dark. It isn't dark, she says. In the latrine, I meant. I always switch off the lights to achieve a better bowel movement. Those mirrors, you understand? When the light is on, the mirrors seem to be sitting in judgment over me, to arbitrate a punishment if everything doesn't come out right. But Aide Turkle said he was cleaning in there, and doing quite a good job, too, I might add, considering the restrictions imposed on him in the dark. Would you care to see? Harding pushed the door open a crack, and a slice of light cut across the latrine floor tile. I caught a glimpse of the supervisor backing off, saying she'd have to decline his offer, but she had further rounds to make. I heard the ward door unlock again up the hall, and she let herself off the ward. Harding called to her to return soon for another visit, and everybody rushed out and shook his hand and pounded his back for the way he'd pulled it off. We stood there in the hall, and the wine went around again. Sefelt said he'd as leave have that vodka if there was something to mix it with. He asked Mr. Turkle if there wasn't something on the ward to put in it, and Turkle said nothing but water. Fredrickson asked what about the cough syrup. They gave me a little now and then from a half-gallon jug in the drug room. It's not bad tasting. You have a key for that room, Turkle? Turkle said the supervisor was the only one on nights who had a key to the drug room, but McMurphy talked him into letting us have a try at picking the lock. Turkle grinned and nodded his head lazily. While he and McMurphy worked at the lock on the drug room with paper clips, the girls and the rest of us ran around at the nurse's station opening files and reading records. "Look here," Scanlon said, waving one of those folders. "Talk about complete. They've even got my first-grade report card in here. Ah, miserable grades. It's miserable." Billy and his girl were going over his folder. She stepped back to look him over. "All these things, Billy? Phrenic this and pathic that? You don't look like you have all these things." The other girl had opened a supply drawer and was suspicious about what the nurses needed with all those hot water bottles, 1,000,000 of them, and Harding was sitting on the big nurse's desk, shaking his head at the whole affair. McMurphy and Turkle got the door of the drug room open and brought out a bottle of thick cherry-colored liquid from the icebox. McMurphy tipped the bottle to the light and read the label out loud. "Artificial flavor, coloring, citric acid, 70% inert materials, that must be water, and 20% alcohol, well that's fine, and 10% codeine. Warning, narcotic may be habit-forming." He unscrewed the bottle and took a taste of it, closing his eyes. He worked his tongue around his teeth and took another swallow and read the label again. "Well," he said, clicked his teeth together just like they'd been sharpened. "If we cut a little bit with the vodka, I think it'd be all right. How we fixed for ice cubes, Turkey, old buddy?" Mixed in paper medicine cups with the liquor and the port wine, the syrup had a taste like a kid's drink but a punch like cactus apple wine. Cold and soothing on the throat and hot and furious once it got down. We turned out the lights in the day room and sat around drinking it. We threw the first couple of cups down like we were taking our medication, drinking it in serious and silent doses and looking one another over to see if it was going to kill anybody. McMurphy and Turkle switched back and forth from the drink to Turkle's cigarettes and got to giggling again as they discussed how it would be to lay that little nurse who went off at midnight. "I'd be scared," Turkle said, "that she might go to whooping me with that big old cross on that chain round her neck. Wouldn't that be a fix to be in now?" "I'd be scared," McMurphy said, "that just about the time I was getting my jollies, she'd reach around behind me with a thermometer and take my temperature." Now that busted everybody up. Harding stopped laughing long enough to join in the joking. "Or worse yet," he said, "just lie there under you with a dreadful concentration on her face and tell you, oh Jesus, listen, tell you what your pulse was. Oh, don't, oh my God. Or even worse, just lie there and be able to calculate your pulse and temperature both, sans instruments. Oh, God, oh, please don't." We laughed till we were rolling around the couches and the chairs, choking and teary-eyed. The girls were so weak from laughing they had to try 2 or 3 times to get to their feet. "I got to go tinkle," the big one said, and went weaving and giggling towards the latrine and missed the door, staggering into the dorm while we all hushed one another with fingers to the lips, waiting till she gave a squeal and we heard old Colonel Matterson roar, "The pillow is a horse!" and come whisking out of the dorm right behind her in his wheelchair. Sefeld wheeled the colonel back to the dorm and showed the girl where the latrine was personally. Told her it was generally used by males only, but he would stand at the door while she was in there and guard against intrusions on her privacy, defended against all comers, by gosh. She thanked him solemnly and shook his hand, and they saluted each other, and while she was inside, here came the colonel out of the dorm in his wheelchair again, and Sefeld had his hands full keeping him out of the latrine. When the girl came out of the door, he was trying to ward off the charges of the wheelchair with his foot while we stood on the edge of the fracas cheering one guy or the other. The girl helped Sephelt put the colonel back to bed, and then the two of them went down the hall and waltzed to music nobody could hear. Harding drank and watched and shook his head. It isn't happening. It's all a collaboration of Kafka and Mark Twain and Martini. McMurphy and Turkle got to worrying that there might still be too many lights, so they went up and down the hall turning out everything that glowed, even the little knee-high night lights, till the place was pitch black. Turkle got out flashlights, and we played tag up and down the hall with wheelchairs from storage, having a big time till we heard one of Sephelt's convulsion cries and went to find him sprawled twitching beside that big girl, Sandy. She was sitting on the floor, brushing her skirt, looking down at Sephelt. "I never experienced anything like it," she said with quiet awe. Fredrickson knelt beside his friend and put a wallet between his teeth to keep him from chewing his tongue and helped him get his pants buttoned. "You all right, Sif? Sif?" Sephelt didn't open his eyes, but he raised a limp hand and picked the wallet out of his mouth. He grinned through his spit. "I'm all right," he said. "Medicate me and turn me loose again." "You really need some medication, Sif?" "Medication. Medication," Fredrickson said over his shoulder, still kneeling. "Medication," Harding repeated and weaved off his flashlight to the drug room. Sandy watched him go with glazed eyes. She was sitting beside Sephelt, stroking his head in wonderment. "Maybe you better bring me something too," she called drunkenly after Harding. "I never experienced anything to come even close to it." Down the hall we heard glass crash, and Harding came back with a double handful of pills. He sprinkled them over Sephelt and the woman like he was crumbling clods into a grave. He raised his eyes toward the ceiling. "Most merciful God, accept these two poor sinners into your arms, and keep the doors ajar for the coming of the rest of us, because you are witnessing the end, the absolute, irrevocable, fantastic end. I've finally realized what is happening. It is our last fling. We are doomed henceforth. Must screw our courage to the sticking point and face up to our impending fate. We shall all of us be shot at dawn, 100 cc's apiece. Miss Ratchet shall line us all against the wall, where we'll face the terrible maw of a muzzle-loading shotgun, which she has loaded with Miltowns, Thorazines, Libriums, Stelazines, and with a wave of her sword, Balooey, tranquilize all of us completely out of existence." He sagged against the wall and slid to the floor, pills hopping out of his hands in all directions like red and green and orange bugs. "Amen," he said, and closed his eyes. The girl on the floor smoothed down her skirt over her long, hard-working legs and looked at Sephelt still grinning and twitching there under the lights beside her, and said, "Never in my life experienced anything to come even halfway near it." Harding's speech, if it hadn't actually sobered people, had at least made them realize the seriousness of what we were doing. The night was getting on, and some thought had to be given to the arrival of the staff in the morning. Billy Bibbett and his girl mentioned that it was after 4 o'clock, and if it was all right, if people didn't mind, they'd like to have Mr. Turkle unlock the seclusion room. They went off under an arch of flashlight beams, and the rest of us went into the day room to see what we could decide about cleaning up. Turkle was all but passed out when he got back from seclusion, and we had to push him into the day room in a wheelchair. As I walked after them, it came to me as a kind of sudden surprise that I was drunk, actually drunk, glowing and grinning and staggering drunk for the first time since the army, drunk along with half a dozen other guys and a couple of girls, right on the big nurse's ward, drunk and running and laughing and carrying on with women square in the center of the Combine's most powerful stronghold. I thought back on the night, on what we'd been doing, and it was near impossible to believe. I had to keep reminding myself that it had truly happened, that we had made it happen. We had just unlocked a window and let it in like you let in the fresh air. Maybe the Combine wasn't all-powerful. What was going to stop us from doing it again, now that we saw we could, or keep us from doing other things we wanted? I felt so good thinking about this that I gave a yell and swooped down on McMurphy and the girl Sandy walking along in front of me, grabbed them both up, one in each arm, and ran all the way to the day room with them, hollering and kicking like kids. I felt that good. Colonel Madison got up again, bright-eyed and full of lessons, and Scanlon wheeled him back to bed. Seffelt, Martini, and Fredrickson said they'd better hit the sack, too. McMurphy and I and Harding and the girl and Mr. Turkle stayed up to finish off the cough syrup and decide what we were going to do about the mess the ward was in. McMurphy and the big girl just sat there and sipped that syrup and grinned at each other and played hand games in the shadows, and Mr. Turkle kept dropping off to sleep. Harding did his best to try to get them concerned. "All of you fail to comprehend the complexities of the situation," he said. "Bull," McMurphy said. Harding slapped the table. "McMurphy, Turkle, you fail to realize what has occurred here tonight on a mental ward, Miss Ratchet's ward. The repercussions will be devastating." McMurphy bit the girl's earlobe. Turkle nodded and opened one eye and said, "That's true. She'll be on tomorrow, too." "I, however, have a plan," Harding said. He got to his feet. He said McMurphy was obviously too far gone to handle the situation himself, and someone else would have to take over. As he talked, he stood straighter and became more sober. He spoke in an earnest and urgent voice, and his hands shaped what he said. I was glad he was there to take over. His plan was that we were to tie up Turkle and make it look like McMurphy had snuck up behind him, tie him up with, say, strips of torn sheet, and relieved him of his keys, and after getting the keys had broken into the drug room, scattered drugs around, and raised hell with the files just to spite the nurse. She'd believe that part. Then he'd unlocked the screen and made his escape. McMurphy said it sounded like a television plot, and it was so ridiculous it couldn't help but work, and he complimented Harding on his clear-headedness. Harding said the plan had its merits. It would keep the other guys out of trouble with the nurse, and keep Turkle his job, and get McMurphy off the ward. He said McMurphy could have the girls drive him to Canada, or Tijuana, or even Nevada if he wanted, and be completely safe. The police never pressed too hard to pick up AWOLs from the hospital, because 90% of them always show back up in a few days, broke and drunk and looking for a free bed and board. We talked about it for a while and finished the cough syrup. We finally talked it to silence. Harding sat back down. McMurphy took his arm from around the girl and looked from me to Harding, thinking. That strange, tired expression on his face again. He asked, what about us? Why didn't we just get up and get our clothes on and make it out with him? I'm not quite ready yet, Mac, Harding told him. Then what makes you think that I am? Harding looked at him in silence for a time and smiled, then said, No, you don't understand. I'll be ready in a few weeks. But I want to do it on my own, by myself, right out that front door, with all the traditional red tape and complications. I want my wife to be here in a car at a certain time to pick me up. I want them to know I was able to do it that way. McMurphy nodded. What about you, Chief? I figure I'm all right. Just I don't know where I want to go yet. And somebody should stay here a few weeks after you're gone to see that things don't start sliding back. What about Billy and Sefelt and Fredrickson and the rest?" "I can't speak for them," Harding said. "They've still got their problems, just like all of us. They're still sick men in a lot of ways, but at least there's that. They're sick men now. No more rabbits, Mac. Maybe they can be well men someday. I can't say." McMurphy thought this over, looking at the backs of his hands. He looked back up to Harding. "Harding, what is it? What happens?" "You mean all this?" McMurphy nodded. Harding shook his head. "I don't think I can give you an answer. Or I could give you Freudian reasons with fancy talk, and that would be right as far as it went. But what you want are the reasons for the reasons, and I'm not able to give you those. Not for the others, anyway. For myself, guilt, shame, fear, self-belittlement. I discovered at an early age that I was, shall we be kind and say different? It's a better, more general word than the other one. I indulged in certain practices that our society regards as shameful, and I got sick. It wasn't the practices, I don't think. It was the feeling that the great, deadly, pointing forefinger of society was pointing at me, and the great voice of millions chanting, "Shame, shame, shame." It's society's way of dealing with someone different. "I'm different," McMurphy said. "Why didn't something like that happen to me? I've had people bugging me about one thing or another as far back as I can remember, but that's not what it didn't drive me crazy." "No, you're right. That's not what drove you crazy. I wasn't giving my reason as the sole reason, though I used to think at one time a few years ago, my turtleneck years, that society's chastising was the sole force that drove one along the road to crazy. But you've caused me to reappraise my theory. There's something else that drives people, strong people like you, my friend, down that road." "Yeah? Not that I'm admitting I'm down that road, but what is this something else?" "It is us." He swept his hand about him in a soft white circle and repeated, "Us." McMurphy half-heartedly said, "Bull," and grinned and stood up, pulling the girl to her feet. He squinted at the dim clock. "It's nearly 5. I need me a little shut-eye before my big getaway. The day shift doesn't come on for another 2 hours yet. Let's leave Billy and Candy down there a while longer. I'll cut out about 6. Sandy, honey, maybe an hour in the dorm would sober us up. What do you say? We got a long drive tomorrow, whether it's Canada or Mexico, wherever." Turkle and Harding and I stood up too. Everybody was still weaving pretty much, still pretty drunk, but a mellow, sad feeling had drifted over the drunk. Turkle said he'd boot McMurphy and the girl out of bed in an hour. My eyes got used to the dark, and I could see McMurphy and the girl snuggled into each other's shoulders, getting comfortable, more like 2 tired little kids than a grown man and a grown woman in bed together to make love. And that's the way the black boys found them when they came in to turn on the dorm lights at 6:30. I've given what happened next a good lot of thought, and I've come around to thinking that it was bound to be, and would have happened in one way or another, at this time or that, even if Mr. Turkle had got McMurphy and the 2 girls up and off the ward like was planned. The big nurse would have found out some way what had gone on, maybe just by the look on Billy's face, and she'd have done the same thing she did whether McMurphy was still around or not. And Billy would have done what he did, and McMurphy would have heard about it and come back. Would have had to come back, because he could no more have sat around outside the hospital playing poker in Carson City or Reno or someplace, and let the big nurse have the last move and get the last play. Then he could have let her get by with it right under his nose. It was like he'd signed on for the whole game, and there wasn't any way of him breaking his contract. As soon as we started getting out of bed and circulating around the ward, the story of what has taken place was spreading in a brush fire of low talk. "They had a what?" asked the ones who hadn't been in on it. "A whore? In the dorm? Jesus!" "Not only a whore," the others told them, "but a drunken blast to boot. McMurphy was planning to sneak her out before the day crew came on, but he didn't wake up." "Now what kind of crock are you giving us?" "No crock. It's every word gospel. I was in on it." Those who had been in on the night started telling about it with a kind of quiet pride and wonder, the way people tell about seeing a big hotel fire or a dam bursting. Very solemn and respectful because the casualties aren't even counted yet. But the longer the telling went on, the less solemn the fellas got. Every time the big nurse and her hustling black boys turned up something new, such as an empty bottle of cough syrup or the fleet of wheelchairs parked at the end of the hall like empty rides in an amusement park, it brought another part of the night back sudden and clear to be told to the guys who weren't in on it and to be savored by the guys who were. Everybody had been herded into the day room by the black boys, chronics and acutes alike, milling together in excited confusion. The two old vegetables sat sunk in their bedding, snapping their eyes and their gums. Everybody was still in pajamas and slippers except McMurphy and the girl. She was dressed, except for her shoes and the nylon stockings which now hung over her shoulder, and he was in his black shorts with the white whales. They were sitting together on a sofa holding hands. The girl had dozed off again, and McMurphy was leaning against her with a satisfied and sleepy grin. Our solemn worry was giving way, in spite of us, to joy and humor. When the nurse found the pile of pills Harding had sprinkled on Sefelt and the girl, we started to pop and snort to keep from laughing, and by the time they found Mr. Turkle in the linen room and let him out blinking and groaning, tangled in 100 yards of torn sheet like a mummy with a hangover, we were roaring. The big nurse took our good humor without so much of a trace of her little pasted smile. Every laugh was being forced right down her throat till it looked as if any minute she'd blow up like a bladder. McMurphy draped one bare leg over the edge of the sofa and pulled his cap down to keep the light from hurting his reddened eyes. And he kept licking out a tongue that looked like it had been shellacked by that cough syrup. He looked sick and terrifically tired, and he kept pressing the heels of his hands against his temples and yawning. But as bad as he seemed to feel, he still held his grin and once or twice went so far as to laugh out loud at some of the things the nurse kept turning up. When the nurse went in to call the main building to report Mr. Turkle's resignation, Turkle and the girl Sandy took the opportunity to unlock the screen again and wave goodbye to all and go loping off across the grounds, stumbling and slipping on the wet, sun-sparkled grass. "He didn't lock it back up," Harding said to McMurphy. Go on after them." McMurphy groaned and opened one eye, bloody as a hatching egg. "You kidding me? I couldn't even get my head through that window, let alone my whole body." "My friend, I don't believe you fully comprehend." "Harding, goddamn you and your big words. All I fully comprehend this morning is I'm still half drunk and sick. Matter of fact, I think you're still drunk too. Chief, how about you? Are you still drunk?" I said that my nose and cheeks didn't have any feeling in them yet, if this could be taken to mean anything. McMurphy nodded once and closed his eyes again. He laced his hands across his chest and slid down in his chair, his chin settling into his collar. He smacked his lips and smiled as if he were napping. "Man," he said, "everybody is still drunk." Harding was still concerned. He kept on about how the best thing for McMurphy to do was to get dressed quickly while old Angel of Mercy was in there calling the doctor again to report the atrocities she had uncovered. But McMurphy maintained that there wasn't anything to get so excited about. He wasn't any worse off than before, was he? "I've took their best punch," he said. Harding threw up his hands and went off, predicting doom. One of the black boys saw the screen was unlocked and locked it and went into the nurse's station for the big flat ledger, came back out running, his finger down the roll and lipping the names he read out loud as he cited the men matched up with them. The roll is listed alphabetically backwards to throw people off, so he didn't get to the B's till right at the last. He looked around the day room without taking his finger from the last name in the ledger. Bibbett. "Where's Billy Bibbett?" His eyes were big. He was thinking Billy'd slipped out right under his nose, and would he ever catch it? "Who saw Billy Bibbett go, you damn goons?" This set people to remembering just where Billy was. There were whispers and laughing again. The black boy went back into the station, and we saw him telling the nurse. She smashed the phone down in the cradle and came out the door with the black boy hot after her. A lock of her hair had broken loose from beneath her white cap and fell across her face like wet ashes. She was sweating between her eyebrows and under her nose. She demanded we tell her where the eloper had gone. She was answered with a chorus of laughter, and her eyes went around the men. "So, he's not gone, is he? Harding, he's still here. On the ward, isn't he? Tell me. Seffelt, tell me." She darted the eyes out with every word, stabbing at the men's faces, but the men were immune to her poison. Their eyes met hers. Their grins mocked the old confident smile she had lost. "Washington? Warren. Come with me for room check." We rose and followed as the three of them went along, unlocking the lab, the tub room, the doctor's office. Scanlon covered his grin with his knotty hand and whispered, "Hey, ain't it going to be some joke on old Billy?" We all nodded. "And Billy's not the only one it's going to be a joke on. Now that I think about it, remember who's in there?" The nurse reached the door of the seclusion room at the end of the hall. We pushed up close to see, crowding and craning to peep over the big nurse and the two black boys as she unlocked it and swung it open. It was dark in the windowless room. There was a squeak and a scuffle in the dark, and the nurse reached out, flicked the light down on Billy and the girl where they were blinking up from that mattress on the floor like two owls from a nest. The nurse ignored the howl of laughter behind her. "William Bibbett." She tried so hard to sound cold and stern. "William Bibbett." "Good morning, Miss Ratchet," Billy said, not even making any move to get up and button his pajamas. He took the girl's hand in his and grinned. "This is candy." The nurse's tongue clucked in her bony throat. "Oh, Billy, 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 I'm so ashamed for you." Billy wasn't awake enough to respond much to her shaming, and the girl was fussing around looking under the mattress for her nylons, moving slow and warm-looking after sleep. Every so often she would stop her dreamy fumbling and look up and smile at the icy figure of the nurse standing there with her arms crossed, then feel to see if her sweater was buttoned and go back to tugging for her nylons caught between the mattress and the tile floor. They both moved like fat cats full of warm milk, lazy in the sun. I guessed they were still fairly drunk, too. "Oh, Billy," the nurse said, like she was so disappointed she might break down and cry. "A woman like this, a cheap, low, painted courtesan," Harding suggested. "Jezebel?" The nurse turned and tried to nail him with her eyes, but he just went on. "Not Jezebel? No." He scratched his head and thought. "How about Salome? She's notoriously evil. Perhaps dame is the word you want. Well, I'm just trying to help." She swung back to Billy. He was concentrating on getting to his feet. He rolled over and came to his knees, butt in the air like a cow getting up, then pushed up on his hands, then came to one foot, then the other, and straightened. He looked pleased with his success, as if he wasn't even aware of us crowding at the door, teasing him and hurrahing him. The loud talk and laughter swirled around the nurse. She looked from Billy and the girl to the bunch of us behind her. The enamel and plastic face was caving in. She shut her eyes and strained to calm her trembling, concentrating. She knew this was it, her back to the wall. When her eyes opened again, they were very small and still. "What worries me, Billy," she said, I could hear the change in her voice, "is how your poor mother is going to take this." She got the response she was after. Billy flinched and put his hand to his cheek like he'd been burned with acid. "Mrs. Bibbitt's always been so proud of your discretion. I know she has. This is going to disturb her terribly. You know how she is when she gets disturbed, Billy. You know how ill the poor woman can become. She's very sensitive, especially concerning her son. She's always spoke so proudly of you. No, his mouth was working. He shook his head, begging her. "You don't, Billy, she said. Your mother and I are old friends." No, he cried. His voice scraped the white bare walls of the seclusion room. He lifted his chin so he was shouting at the moon of light at the ceiling. No. We stopped laughing. We watched Billy folding into the floor, head going back, knees coming forward. He rubbed his hand up and down that green pant leg. He was shaking his head in a panic like a kid that's been promised a whipping just as soon as the willow is cut. The nurse touched his shoulder to comfort him. The touch shook him like a blow. "Billy, I don't want her to believe something like this of you, but what am I to think?" Don't tell, Miss Ratched. Billy, I have to tell. I hate to believe you would behave like this, but really, what else can I think? I find you alone on a mattress with this sort of woman. No, I didn't. I was... His hand went to his cheek again and stuck there. "She did. Billy, this girl could not have pulled you in here forcibly." She shook her head. "Understand, I would like to believe something else, for your poor mother's sake." The hand pulled down his cheek, raking long red marks. "She did." He looked around him. "And McMurphy, he did, and Harding, and the rest. They teased me, called me things." Now his face was fastened to hers. He didn't look to one side or the other, but only straight ahead at her face, like there was a spiraling light there instead of features, a hypnotizing swirl of cream, white, and blue and orange. He swallowed and waited for her to say something, but she wouldn't. Her skill, her fantastic mechanical power flooded back into her, analyzing the situation and reporting to her that all she had to do was keep quiet. "They made me. Please, Miss Ratched, they me. She checked her beam, and Billy's face pitched downward, sobbing with relief. She put a hand on his neck and drew his cheek to her starched breast, stroking his shoulder while she turned a slow, contemptuous look across the bunch of us. "It's all right, Billy. It's all right. No one else is going to harm you. It's all right. I'll explain to your mother." She continued to glare at us as she spoke. It was strange to hear that voice, soft and soothing and warm as a pillow, coming out of a face hard as porcelain. "All right, Billy, come along with me. You can wait over here in the doctor's office. There's no reason for you to be submitted to sitting out in the day room with these friends of yours." The chronics across the way had stopped milling around and were settling into their slots. I looked at McMurphy out of the corner of my eye, trying not to be obvious about it. He was in his chair in the corner, resting a second before he came out for the next round, in a long line of next rounds. The thing he was fighting, you couldn't whip it for good. All you could do was keep on whipping it till you couldn't come out any more and somebody else had to take your place. There was more phoning going on in the nurses' station and a number of authorities showing up for a tour of the evidence. When the doctor himself finally came in, every one of these people gave him a look like the whole thing had been planned by him, or at least condoned and authorized. He was white and shaky under their eyes. You could see he'd already heard about most of what had gone on here on his ward, but the big nurse outlined it for him again in slow, loud details so we could hear it too. Hear it in the proper way this time, solemnly, with no whispering or giggling while she talked. I left him in your office. Judging from his present state, I suggest you see him right away. He's been through a terrible ordeal. I shudder to think of the damage that must have been done to the poor boy. She waited until the doctor shuddered too. I think you should go see if you can speak with him. He needs a lot of sympathy. He's in a pitiful state. The doctor nodded again and walked off towards his office. We watched him go. Mac, Scanlon said, listen, you don't think any of us are being taken in by this crap, do you? It's bad, but we know where the blame lies. We ain't blaming you. No, I said, none of us blame you, and wished I'd had my tongue pulled out as soon as I saw the way he looked at me. He closed his eyes and relaxed, waiting, it looked like. Harding got up and walked over to him and had just opened his mouth to say something when the doctor's voice, screaming down the hall, smashed a common horror and realization onto everybody's face. "Nurse!" he yelled. "Good Lord, nurse!" She ran, and 3 black boys ran down the hall to where the doctor was still calling, but not a patient got up. We knew there wasn't anything for us to do now but just sit tight and wait for her to come to the day room to tell us what we all had known was one of the things that was bound to happen. She walked straight to McMurphy. "Billy cut his throat," she said. She waited, hoping he would say something. He wouldn't look up. He opened the doctor's desk and found some instruments and cut his throat. The poor, miserable, misunderstood boy killed himself. He's there now in the doctor's chair with his throat cut. She waited again, but he still wouldn't look up. First Charles Cheswick, and now William Bibbett. I hope you're finally satisfied. Playing with human lives, gambling with human lives, as if you thought yourself to be a god. She turned and walked into the nurse's station and closed the door behind her, leaving a shrill, killing cold sound ringing in the tubes of light over our heads. First I had a quick thought to try to stop him, talk him into taking what he'd already won, and let her have the last round, but another, bigger thought wiped the first thought away completely. I suddenly realized with a crystal certainty that neither I nor any of the half-score of us could stop him. That Harding's arguing, or my grabbing him from behind, or old Colonel Madison's teaching, or Scanlon's griping, or all of us together couldn't rise up and stop him. We couldn't stop him because we were the ones making him do it. It wasn't the nurse that was forcing him. It was our need that was making him push himself slowly up from sitting, his big hands driving down on the leather chair arms, pushing him up, rising and standing like one of those moving picture zombies, obeying orders beamed at him from 40 masters. It was us that had been making him go on for weeks, keeping him standing long after his feet and legs had given out, weeks of making him wink and grin and laugh and go on with his act long after his humor had been parched dry between 2 electrodes. We made him stand and hitch up his black shorts like they were horsehide chaps and push back his black cap with one finger like it was a 10-gallon Stetson, slow, mechanical gestures. And when he walked across the floor, you could hear the iron in his bare heels ring sparks out of the tile. Only at the last, after he'd smashed through that glass door, her face swinging around, with terror forever ruining any other look she might ever try to use again, screaming when he grabbed for her and ripped her uniform all the way down the front, screaming again when the two nippled circles started from her chest and swelled out and out, bigger than anybody had ever even imagined, warm and pink in the light. Only at the last, after the officials realized that the three black boys weren't going to do anything but stand and watch, and that they would have to beat him off without their help, doctors and supervisors and nurses prying those heavy red fingers out of the white flesh of her throat as if they were her neck bones, jerking him backward off of her with a loud heave of breath. Only then did he show any sign that he might be anything than a sane, willful, dogged man performing a hard duty that finally just had to be done, like it or not. He gave a cry. At the last, falling backwards, his face appearing to us for a second upside down before he was smothered on the floor by a pile of white uniforms, he let himself cry out. A sound of cornered animal fear and hate and surrender and defiance that if you ever trailed coon or cougar or lynx is like the last sound the treed and shot and falling animal makes as the dogs get him, when he finally doesn't care any more about anything but himself and his dying. I hung around another couple of weeks to see what was to come. Everything was changing. Seffelt and Fredrickson signed out together against medical advice, and 2 days later another 3 acutes left, and 6 more transferred to another ward. There was a lot of investigation about the party on the ward and about Billy's death, and the doctor was informed that his resignation would be accepted, and he informed them that they would have to go the whole way and can him if they wanted him out. The big nurse was over in medical for a week, so for a while we had the little Jap nurse from Disturbed running the ward. That gave the guys a chance to change a lot of the ward policy. By the time the big nurse came back, Harding had even got the tub room back open and was in there dealing blackjack himself, trying to make that airy, thin voice of his sound like McMurphy's auctioneer bellow. He was dealing when he heard her key hit the lock. We all left the tub room and came out in the hall to meet her, to ask about McMurphy. She jumped back 2 steps when we approached, and I thought for a second she might run. Her face was bloated blue and out of shape on one side, closing one eye completely, and she had a heavy bandage around her throat and a new white uniform. Some of the guys grinned at the front of it. In spite of its being smaller and tighter and more starched than her old uniforms, it could no longer conceal the fact that she was a woman. Smiling, Harding stepped up close and asked what had become of Mac. She took a little pad and pencil from the pocket of her uniform and wrote, "He will be back," on it and passed it around. The paper trembled in her hand. "Are you sure?" Harding wanted to know after he'd read it. We'd heard all kinds of things, that he'd knocked down 2 aides undisturbed and taken their keys and escaped, that he'd been sent back to the work farm, even that the nurse in charge now, till they got a new doctor, was giving him special therapy. "Are you quite positive?" Harding repeated. "Yes, Mr. Harding," she wrote. "I would not say so if I was not positive. He will be back." Harding read the paper, then tore it up and threw the pieces at her. She flinched and raised her hand to protect the bruised side of her face from the paper. "Lady, I think you're full of so much bullshit," Harding told her. She stared at him, and her hand waved over the pad a second. But then she turned and walked into the nurse's station, sticking the pad and pencil back down in the pocket of her uniform. Harding said, "Our conversation was a bit spotty, it seemed. But then, when you are told that you are full of bullshit, what kind of written comeback can you make?" She tried to get her ward back into shape, But it was difficult with McMurphy's presence still tromping up and down the halls and laughing out loud in the meetings and singing in the latrines. She couldn't rule with her old power anymore, not by writing things on pieces of paper. She was losing her patients one after the other. After Harding signed out and was picked up by his wife, and George transferred to a different ward, just 3 of us were left out of the group that had been on the fishing crew, myself and Martini and Scanlon. I didn't want to leave just yet, because she seemed to be too sure. She seemed to be waiting for one more round, and I wanted to be there in case it came off. And one morning after McMurphy'd been gone 3 weeks, she made her last play. The ward door opened, and the black boys wheeled in this gurney with a chart at the bottom that said in heavy black letters, McMurphy, Randall P., post-operative. And below this was written in ink, lobotomy. They pushed it into the day room and left it standing against the wall along next to the vegetables. We stood at the foot of the gurney reading the chart, then looked up to the other end at the head dented into the pillow, a swirl of red hair over a face milk white except for the heavy purple bruises around the eyes. After a minute of silence, Scanlon turned and spat on the floor. What's that old bitch trying to put over on us anyhow, for crap's sakes? That ain't him. Nothing like him, Martini said. How stupid she think we are. Oh, they done a pretty fair job, though, Martini said, moving up alongside the head and pointing as he talked. See, they got the broken nose and that crazy scar, even the sideburns. Sure, Scanlon growled, but hell. I pushed past the other patients to stand beside Martini. Sure, they can do things like scars and broken noses, I said, but they can't do that look. There's nothing in the face, just like one of those store dummies. Ain't that right, Scanlon? Scanlon spat again. Damn right, whole thing's, too blank. Anybody can see that. Look here, one of the patients said, peeling back the sheet. Tattoos. Sure, I said. They can do tattoos, but the arms, huh? The arms. They couldn't do those. His arms were big. For the rest of the afternoon, Scanlon and Martini and I ridiculed what Scanlon called that crummy sideshow fake lying there on the gurney. But as the hours passed and the swelling began subsiding around the eyes, I saw more and more guys strolling over to look at the figure. I watched them walk by, acting like they were going to the magazine rack or the drinking fountain, so they could sneak another look at the face. I watched and tried to figure out what he would have done. I was only sure of one thing. He wouldn't have left something like that sit there in the day room with his name tacked on it for 20 or 30 years, so the big nurse could use it as an example of what can happen if you buck the system. I was sure of that. I waited that night until the sounds in the dorm told me everybody was asleep, and until the black boys had stopped making their rounds. Then I turned my head on the pillow so I could see the bed next to mine. I had been listening to the breathing for hours, since they had wheeled the gurney in and lifted the stretcher onto the bed, listening to the lungs stumbling and stopping, then starting again, hoping as I listened they would stop for good. But I hadn't turned to look yet. There was a cold moon at the window, pouring into the dorm like skim milk. I sat up in bed, and my shadow fell across the body, seeming to cleave it in half between the hips and the shoulders, leaving only a black space. The swelling had gone down enough in the eyes that they were open. They stared into the full light of the moon, open and undreaming, glazed from being open so long without blinking until they were like smudged fuses in a fuse box. I moved to pick up the pillow, and the eyes fastened on the movement and followed me as I stood up and crossed the few feet between the beds. The big hard body had a tough grip on life. It fought a long time against having it taken away, flailing and thrashing around so much I finally had to lie full length on top of it and scissor the kicking legs with mine while I mashed the pillow into the face. I lay there on top of the body for what seemed days, until the thrashing stopped. Until it was still a while, and had shuddered once, and was still again. Then I rolled off. I lifted the pillow, and in the moonlight I saw the expression hadn't changed from the bland, dead-end look the least bit, even under suffocation. I took my thumbs and pushed the lids down and held them till they stayed. Then I lay back on my bed. I lay for a while, holding the covers over my face, and thought I was being pretty quiet, but Scanlon's voice hissing from his bed let me know I wasn't. "Take it easy, Chief," he said. "Take it easy. It's okay." "Shut up," I whispered. "Go back to sleep." It was quiet a while. Then I heard him hiss again and ask, "Is it finished?" I told him, yeah. "Christ," he said then, "she'll know. You realize that, don't you? Sure, nobody'd be able to prove anything. Anybody could have kicked off in a post-operative like he was. Happens all the time. But her, she'll know." I didn't say anything. "Was I you, Chief, I'd breeze my tail out of here. Yes, sir. I tell you what, you leave out of here, and I'll say I saw him up and moving around after you left, and cover you that way. That's the best idea, don't you think?" "Oh, yeah, just like that. Just ask him to unlock the door and let me out." "No, he showed you how one time, if you think back. That very first week, you remember?" I didn't answer him, and he didn't say anything else, and it was quiet in the dorm again. I lay there a few minutes longer and then got up and started putting on my clothes. When I finished dressing, I reached into McMurphy's nightstand and got his cap and tried it on. It was too small, and I was suddenly ashamed of trying to wear it. I dropped it on Scanlon's bed as I walked out of the dorm. He said, "Take it easy, buddy," as I walked out. The moon, straining through the screen of the tub room windows, showed the hunched, heavy shape of the control panel, glinted off the chrome fixtures and glass gauges so cold I could almost hear the click of it striking. I took a deep breath and bent over and took the levers. I heaved my legs under me and felt the grind of weight at my feet. I heaved again and heard the wires and connections tearing out of the floor. I lurched it up to my knees and was able to get an arm around it and my other hand under it. The chrome was cold against my neck and the side of my head. I put my back towards the screen, then spun and let the momentum carry the panel through the screen and window with a ripping crash. The glass splashed out in the moon like a bright cold water baptizing the sleeping earth. Panting, I thought for a second about going back and getting Scanlon and some of the others. But then I heard the running squeak of the black boy's shoes in the hall, and I put my hand on the sill and vaulted after the panel into the moonlight. I ran across the grounds in the direction I remembered seeing the dog go, towards the highway. I remember I was taking huge strides as I ran, seeming to step and float a long ways before my next foot struck the earth. I felt like I was flying, free. Nobody bothers coming after an AWOL, I knew, and Scanlon could handle any questions about the dead man. No need to be running like this, but I didn't stop. I ran for miles before I stopped and walked up the embankment onto the highway. I caught a ride with a guy, a Mexican guy, going north in a truck full of sheep, and gave him such a good story about me being a professional Indian wrestler the syndicate had tried to lock up in a nut house, that he stopped real quick and gave me a leather jacket to cover my greens and loaned me $10 to eat on while I hitchhiked to Canada. I had him write his address down before he drove off, and I told him I'd send him the money as soon as I got a little ahead. I might go to Canada eventually, but I think I'll stop along the Columbia on the way. I'd like to check around Portland and Hood River and the Dalles to see if there's any of the guys I used to know back in the village who haven't drunk themselves goofy. I'd like to see what they've been doing since the government tried to buy their right to be Indians. I've even heard that some of the tribe have took to building their old ramshackle wood scaffolding all over that big $1 million hydroelectric dam and are spearing salmon in the spillway. I'd give something to see that. Mostly, I'd just like to look over the country around the gorge again, just to bring some of it clear in my mind again. I've been away a long time.